Clara May Whitlock heard her father say her name in front of the entire congregation, not with pride, not with sorrow, but with relief. The kind of relief a man feels when he has finally found somewhere to put something he never wanted. Her hands were folded in her lap so tightly the bones ached. And she did not cry, because she had learned long ago that crying only made people more certain you were exactly the burden they always said you were. Her father was sending her to a stranger in the Montana mountains, a lone rancher the whole town pitied. What nobody knew was that this man, who had spent 8 years refusing to let anyone close, was about to see her more clearly than anyone in her entire life ever had. If you've ever been told you were too quiet, too plain, too much, stay with me all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments, so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara May Whitlock found it sitting on the kitchen table, propped against the sugar bowl like it was nothing more than a grocery list or a note about firewood. Her name was written across the front in her father's hand, that tight, careful penmanship he reserved for business matters. Not for birthdays, not for Christmas, for business. She picked it up slowly. She already knew, somewhere in the part of her that had learned to brace for things, that whatever was inside that envelope was going to change everything. She was right. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table, smoothed it flat with both palms, and stood very still for a long moment while the summer heat pressed in through the kitchen window and her younger sister Violet's laughter floated in from the yard outside. The letter said she was being sent to Montana. The letter said there was a man. A rancher. He had land, the letter said. He had a house. He was respectable. Her father had written, which Clara had come to understand meant he was the kind of man who would take what was offered without asking too many questions. The letter did not ask if she wanted to go. Of course it didn't. Her father, Horace Whitlock, was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel with fists or with shouting. He was cruel the way drought is cruel, slow, quiet, methodical. He drained the life out of things without ever raising his voice. Clara was 27 years old, and she had spent every single one of those years learning that in the Whitlock household there was a clear and unspoken hierarchy. There was Violet, who was beautiful and laughed easily and made people feel warm just by walking into a room. There was Josephine, who was clever and sharp and had married a banker's son at 19. And then there was Clara. Clara, who was too quiet, too plain, too practical. Clara, who spent her mornings doing the household accounts because nobody else wanted to, who stayed up late mending the things other people tore, who nursed the sick chickens back to health and kept the pantry organized and made sure there was always enough flour even when money was tight. Clara, who had never once heard her father say her name with anything that resembled pride. "You're not pretty enough to be picky," he told her once, when she was 22 and had quietly turned down the advances of a man twice her age who smelled like whiskey and looked at her like she was livestock. Horace Whitlock hadn't been angry. He'd been bored. Disappointed the way a man is disappointed when a tool doesn't work the way he expected. She had said nothing. She had learned early that saying nothing was the safest thing. She was still standing at the kitchen table when Violet came inside, flushed from the heat, her yellow hair damp at her temples. "Father says you read the letter," Violet said. She didn't ask how Clara felt about it. She didn't ask if Clara was all right. She looked at Clara the way she always looked at Clara, with that faint, uncomfortable mix of pity and relief that came from knowing, on some level, that it could have been her. "I read it," Clara said. "He says the man is 42. That's not so old," Clara agreed. "It's not so old, and he has land. Father says it's good land. Up near the mountains somewhere." Violet leaned against the doorframe, picking at a loose thread on her cuff. "It could be worse." "Clara, you know it could." Clara looked at her sister for a moment. She looked at the easy, uncomplicated way Violet stood the way she took up space without ever wondering if she had the right. She thought about all the years she had spent making herself smaller so Violet could be larger. All the compliments she'd never chased, all the rooms she'd slipped out of. All the mornings she'd woken up and wondered, with a kind of tired, distant curiosity, whether anyone in this house would notice if she simply wasn't there anymore. "You're right," Clara said. "It could be worse." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about things like this a long time ago. Her father spoke to her that evening after supper. In the brief, efficient way he spoke to her about everything, as if the conversation were a transaction that needed to be completed before he could move on to something more important. "The man's name is Ethan Colehart," Horace said, without looking up from the paper on his desk. "He has a ranch up in the Montana Territory. Good reputation. He's been looking for a capable woman to manage the household. Not a wife in the romantic sense, mind you. More of a practical arrangement." Clara stood in the doorway. She had her hands folded in front of her. "And you thought of me," she said. Horace finally looked up. Something shifted in his face, something that might have been discomfort if he'd been a man more willing to examine his own conscience. "You're 27, Clara. The opportunities aren't going to improve with time. Colehart is a good man from everything I've been told. He's quiet, solitary. He won't bother you much." "He won't bother me much," she repeated. "That's right. Is that meant to be a reassurance?" Horace set down his pen. "I'm doing what I think is best for the family. You understand that, don't you?" And there it was, the family. Always the family. As if she were a number on a ledger that had never quite balanced. And this was the way to finally make the books work out. "Of course," Clara said. "Good." He picked his pen back up. "You'll leave Friday." She packed on Thursday night. Alone, after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. She didn't have much. A dress for Sundays, 2 for working. Her good boots, a small tin of threads and needles. The ledger she'd been keeping for her father's accounts. And a book of mathematics she'd bought herself from a peddler 3 years ago and kept hidden under her mattress because books like that were not considered appropriate for a woman who was supposed to be focused on practical things. She held that book for a long time before she put it in her bag. Then she took out the ledger, the one full of her father's accounts. Years of careful numbers in her handwriting, and she set it on the desk in the parlor where he would find it in the morning. She owed him nothing, but she left it anyway. That was the thing about Clara May Whitlock. Even at her lowest, she didn't become less than herself. She had been taught her whole life that being good, being careful, being useful, that none of it counted for anything. And still she kept being those things, not because anyone noticed. Because she couldn't figure out how to be otherwise. The journey to Montana took 11 days. She rode the train as far as the rail line went, then a stagecoach the rest of the way. Sitting pressed against the window with her bag on her lap, watching the land change from green Tennessee hills to open, breathtaking stretches of prairie that seemed to go on forever. Until the mountains appeared on the horizon, like something out of a story she'd never been told. She had never seen mountains before. She didn't say that to anyone. The town was called Harlow Creek. And it was the kind of place that knew everybody's business and wasn't shy about it. Clara stepped off the stagecoach into the full blazing heat of a Montana summer afternoon and immediately felt every pair of eyes in the vicinity swing toward her. There were maybe a dozen people visible on the main street men outside the general store. 2 women talking near the post office, a boy chasing a dog through the dust, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing. She understood immediately and instinctively what they were seeing. A plain woman in a faded blue dress traveling alone, arriving on a Tuesday with a single bag and no one to meet her. She had learned how to read the particular quality of that kind of attention. It wasn't cruel, not yet. It was just assessing. She lifted her chin slightly and walked toward the nearest building with a purpose she didn't entirely feel. The woman at the post office, stout, sharp-eyed, wearing an apron with a smear of something red on the front, watched her approach with open curiosity. "You'd be the Whitlock woman," the woman said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either, simply as a statement of fact. "Clara Whitlock," Clara confirmed. "I'm looking for Ethan Colhart's ranch." The woman she introduced herself, eventually, as Hattie Drummond, postmistress and unofficial keeper of Harlow Creek's collective memory, looked at Clara for a moment with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "Ethan doesn't come into town much," Hattie said. "I was told there would be someone to meet me. Joe Carter was supposed to come." Hattie glanced down the street. "He's probably at the feed store. I'll send my boy." She paused, still studying Clara with that measuring look. "You know about Ethan?" Then, about his situation. Clara thought about the letter. The careful, impersonal language her father had used. A capable woman to manage the household. Quiet, solitary. "My father mentioned he was a rancher," Clara said. "That he lived near the mountains." Hattie Drummond made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh. "That's one way to put it, I suppose." She looked at Clara once more, like she was trying to decide something. "He's a good man. Ethan Colhart. You understand me? Whatever you've been told and whatever you'll hear, he's a good man." Clara didn't know what to do with that. Exactly. But she filed it away. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. Joseph Carter was an old man with a weathered face and kind eyes who apologized 3 times in the space of 2 minutes for being late. Blamed his knees, and then blamed the heat, and then blamed a stubborn mule named Augustus, who had opinions about harness fitting. And Clara liked him immediately. He loaded her single bag into the back of a wagon like it was the most precious cargo he'd ever transported. And she climbed up beside him, and they headed out of Harlow Creek and into the open land that stretched toward the mountains. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Clara watched the mountains grow slowly closer. "You nervous?" Joe asked after a time. "A little," she admitted. "Don't need to be." Ethan stopped, seemed to be choosing his words. "He's not what people say he is. They talk in town. They always talk. But he's not hard-hearted." He's another pause. "He's been alone a long time. He forgot what it's like to have someone around." Clara considered this. "How long has he been alone? Since Rebecca?" Joe's voice changed a little on the name. Got quieter. "That was 8 years ago. Woman he was going to marry. She got sick in the winter, and by spring she was gone." He shook his head slowly. "Ethan closed up after that. Not mean. Just closed. Like a door that got stuck." Clara looked at the mountains. They were close enough now that she could see the way the snow sat, on the highest peaks even in summer, blazing white against the deep blue sky. "I'm not here to fix him," she said quietly. Joe glanced at her, surprised. Then a small smile moved across his weathered face. "No," he said. "I don't reckon you are." The ranch was larger than she'd expected. She didn't know what she had expected exactly. Her father's words, "good land, comfortable house," had been so deliberately vague that she'd filled in the gaps with something modest and manageable. What she found instead was a spread of land that seemed to breathe. Wide pastures running up toward timber and rock, a house that was big in the solid. Unsentimental way of a place built for work rather than show. Surrounded by barns and outbuildings, and the sounds of horses and men moving through the heat of the afternoon. Joe helped her down from the wagon and led her toward the house. She noticed, the moment they came around the corner of the barn, the man standing at the fence. He had his back to her. Tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall you add to a man in memory, but the kind you note the moment you see it. Dark hair shot through with silver. Worn a little long, curling at the collar of a faded blue work shirt. His hands were on the top rail of the fence, and he was watching the horses in the paddock with the absolute, concentrated stillness of a man who had learned to be quiet in his own skin. "Ethan," Joe called. The man turned, Clara had been looking at men her whole life, the way plain women learn to look at people quickly, carefully, cataloging what they see before it can be used against them. She was used to seeing, in a man's first glance toward her, the faint recalibration that happened when expectation met reality. She'd seen it in her father's business associates, in the men at church, in the rancher her father had tried to introduce her to 3 years ago. Ethan Colehart looked at her and showed her nothing of the kind. He just looked, quiet and direct, the way you'd look at a person you were actually trying to see. "Miss Whitlock," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice shaped by years of giving instructions to horses and men, and not wasting many words on either. "Mr. Colehart," she said. A pause. The summer afternoon pressed down around them. Somewhere behind her, Joe Carter had found something very important to look at in the opposite direction. "You had a long trip," Ethan said. "You hungry?" She almost laughed. Not from amusement, from the sheer unexpected relief of it. No assessment, no speech, no careful arrangement of words designed to set expectations. "Just, are you hungry?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, turned toward the house. "Martha'll have something." And that was it. That was the beginning. Martha Bellamy was the ranch cook. A short, broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with flour permanently embedded in the creases of her hands and an opinion about everything. Delivered in the flat, unapologetic cadence of a woman who had learned that the fastest way through life was to say what you meant. She took one look at Clara and handed her a biscuit. "Sit," she said, jerking her chin toward the kitchen table. "You look like you've been traveling on prayers and nothing else." Clara sat. She ate the biscuit. It was the best thing she had tasted in 11 days. So Martha said, moving around the kitchen with the comfortable efficiency of someone in their own domain. "You're the woman Horace Whitlock sent." "I'm the woman who decided to come," Clara said. Before she could stop herself, Martha turned to look at her. For a moment, Clara thought she'd said the wrong thing. Then Martha Bellamy's face opened into a grin that transformed it entirely. "Good," she said. "There's a difference, and you know it." She turned back to the stove, still smiling to herself. "I think you might be all right." "Miss Whitlock." Ethan showed her the house after supper. It was practical and clean and entirely devoid of anything that wasn't functional, which Clara found oddly restful after a lifetime in a house where every surface was cluttered with the evidence of other people's preferences. There was a bedroom for her, small but private, with a window that looked out toward the mountains. There was an office off the main hall, where the ranch accounts were kept, ledgers stacked on a desk, ink and pens in a jar, the quiet, familiar smell of paper and mathematics. She stopped in the doorway of that room for just a moment, looking at those ledgers. "The accounts are a mess," Ethan said. Behind her, a simple statement, no embarrassment in it. "I can see that," she said. "Joe does his best. He's better with horses. I can straighten them out." She glanced back at him. "If that's useful." He studied her for a moment. "That's what you're here for." "That's part of what I'm here for," she agreed carefully. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly. Not yet, but a kind of attention, the kind that meant he'd heard the distinction. "The room's yours," he said. "There's no I want to be clear about what this arrangement is. You have your own space. You're not—" He stopped. "I don't want you to think you have no choice here. You came a long way. If it's not what you expected, Miss Colehart," Clara said. He stopped. "I left Tennessee with one bag and no promises. I'm not expecting anything in particular." She met his eyes steadily. "But I do intend to be useful, and I intend to be here on my own terms. If those two things can coexist with whatever you need from this arrangement, I think we'll get along fine." Ethan Colehart looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I reckon we might." The trouble started on her 5th day. She had expected it, in the abstract. Small towns had long memories and short patience for things that didn't fit their established categories. And a plain unmarried woman arriving at a solitary rancher's property was the kind of thing that Harlow Creek was going to have opinions about. She just hadn't expected it to arrive quite so quickly. Or in quite the form it did. She was walking back from the general store she'd gone to collect a package Joe had been expecting when she heard her name. Or rather, not her name. What she heard was, "Colhart's woman. Can't imagine what he was thinking, not even pretty." Is she? She had walked past two women standing outside the milliner's shop, and they hadn't bothered to lower their voices much. She kept walking. She had learned this particular skill so young, she didn't even have to think about it anymore, the ability to carry on moving while absorbing something painful. The way you keep walking after you've twisted your ankle. Getting to somewhere private before you let yourself feel it. She made it to the end of the block before someone fell into step beside her. She turned, startled. The man walking next to her was broad-shouldered and prosperous-looking, with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and the particular confidence of someone accustomed to be an important person in any given situation. "Miss Whitlock," he said, tipping his hat. "I believe we haven't been properly introduced." "Caleb Montgomery. I own the Montgomery Cattle Company, biggest operation in this valley, Mr. Montgomery," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I don't believe we have been introduced. Which makes it interesting that you know my name." He laughed easy. "Practiced. Small town. Miss Fast." He matched his stride to hers. And there was something in the way he did it that she didn't like, the assumption of welcome. "I wanted to say on behalf of the community that we hope you find Harlow Creek a comfortable place." "That's very kind," she said. "Ethan Colhart is something of a solitary type, as I'm sure you've noticed. Doesn't mix much. Some people find that limiting." His voice was pleasant, conversational, but she was listening beneath the words, and she heard the edges. "If you ever find yourself in need of company, or conversation, or advice about the area, my door is always open." Clara stopped walking. Caleb Montgomery stopped too, slightly surprised, turning to face her. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, "I appreciate the welcome. And I don't doubt that your door is always open." She looked at him calmly. "But I came to Harlow Creek to work, not to seek out new acquaintances. If you'll excuse me." She walked away. She felt his eyes on her back for half a block. That evening, she spread the ranch ledgers across the desk in the small office and began, methodically, to read. She was 3 hours in when she heard the door and looked up to find Ethan Colhart standing in the hall. Jacket off, hat in hand, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has come home expecting a quiet house and found something unexpected instead. "It's late," he said. She turned a page. "These accounts go back 4 years. There are discrepancies." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came and stood in the doorway of the office. Not quite entering, maintaining, she'd noticed, a careful distance. As if she were something that startled easily. She didn't particularly, but she appreciated the care. "How many discrepancies?" he said. "Enough." She looked up at him. "Someone has been paying too much for supplies. Consistently. For the better part of 3 years." She touched the relevant column with one finger. "It's not obvious unless you run the numbers against market rates." Which she paused. "Which I suspect no one has done." Ethan looked at the ledger. Something in his face shifted, not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation of a thing he'd half suspected. "Joe handles the orders," he said. "Joe isn't the problem," she said firmly. "Joe is recording what's on the invoices. The invoices are the problem." She met his eyes. "Someone is overcharging you, Mr. Colhart. Significantly. And I think they've been doing it for a long time." Silence stretched between them. "Who's the primary supplier?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Montgomery," he said. Clara said nothing. She looked down at the ledger and then back up at him. "I'll need the original contracts," she said. "Whatever you signed when you first started doing business with him." "I'll find them," Ethan said. He stood there a moment longer, this big, quiet man with his hat in his hands. Standing in the doorway, looking at a woman he'd known for 5 days, who had just found something in 4-year-old numbers that nobody else had bothered to look for. His expression was complicated in a way she couldn't fully read. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded. She turned back to the ledger. She was still working when the house went quiet and the last lamp but hers burned out. She didn't mind. For the first time in a very long time. She was doing exactly what she was good at, in a room where no one had told her she shouldn't. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. The contracts were not where Ethan thought they were. He spent the better part of the next morning going through the wooden chest in the back of the office, the one that held 8 years of paperwork. Folded and stacked with the kind of approximate organization of a man who kept things because he knew he should, not because he ever planned to look at them again. Clara sat at the desk, working through the ledgers, and didn't say a word while he pulled out papers and set them in piles and occasionally made a low sound of frustration under his breath. Joe Carter appeared in the doorway at one point, looked at the two of them, and quietly disappeared again. "They should be here," Ethan said. For the 3rd time. "Take your time," Clara said. "I had them. I remember signing them. Montgomery sent his man out with the paperwork 3 years ago, and He stopped. "I signed what was in front of me. I should have read them more carefully." Clara looked up from the ledger. "Most people sign what's in front of them when they've been doing business with someone for a year without problems," she said. "That's not carelessness. That's trust." He glanced at her sideways. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He found the contracts 20 minutes later, wedged behind a loose board at the back of the chest, not where a man would put them if he were filing carefully, but where they might end up if someone had gone through the chest looking for something and replaced things in a hurry. Clara noticed that, but she didn't say anything yet. She took the contracts and laid them flat on the desk beside the ledgers and began reading with the focused, methodical attention she brought to numbers, not fast, not impatient, but with the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Ethan stood behind her and to the left, near enough to see the pages but not crowding her. And she was aware of him the way you become aware of something large and quiet, standing near you, not threatening, just present. "Here," she said after a while. She put her finger on a clause midway through the 2nd page. "The pricing agreement," she said. "It specifies rates at the time of signing and then says," she read carefully, "adjusted annually in accordance with market conditions as determined by the supplier." She looked up at him. "Do you see?" Ethan leaned forward reading, his jaw tightened. "He sets his own market rate," Ethan said. "He sets his own market rate," Clara confirmed. "And as long as he adjusts it gradually enough, year by year. No one runs the numbers to see how far it's drifted from what anyone else charges." She straightened up. "Mr. Colhart, you have been overpaying for feed lumber and dry goods by somewhere between 20 and 30% for the last 3 years. The silence in the office was the particular kind that happens when a man realizes he's been made a fool of by someone he trusted. "I want to see the full numbers," Ethan said, his voice carefully controlled. "I'll have them ready by tonight," Clara said. "I need the last 3 years of supply receipts as well." He nodded. He pushed off the desk and went to find Joe, and Clara turned back to her work. And neither of them said anything else. But something had shifted in the room. Something that had been tentative the day before was now something else. The beginning, maybe, of a thing that hadn't had a name yet. She found the receipts in the barn. Of all places, Joe had been storing them there in a tin box under the workbench, not from any intention to hide them. Just because that was where he did his paperwork, sitting on an upturned crate with the smell of horses around him, writing down what came in and what went out in his careful, laborious handwriting. Clara carried the tin box back to the office. and when she sat down at the desk and opened it and saw the sheer volume of paper inside, she allowed herself exactly 1 moment of looking at it with her hands flat on the table and her eyes closed. Then she opened her eyes and started sorting. Martha appeared in the doorway around noon with a plate of food and a look on her face that suggested she had made a decision about something. "You're going to work yourself into a wall," Martha said, setting the plate on the edge of the desk with the firm authority of someone who had been managing this household longer than Clara had been here. "I'm all right," Clara said. "Eat," Martha said. "The numbers will still be wrong after lunch." Clara almost smiled at that. She picked up a biscuit. Martha didn't leave. She leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed and watched Clara eat with the same focused attention that Clara gave to ledgers. "How long you been doing accounts?" Martha asked. "Since I was 12, Clara said. "My father's business. Nobody else wanted to. And they didn't stop me." Clara set down the biscuit. "There's a difference." Martha's mouth curved. It was the same thing Clara had said the day before, in this same room, and Clara hadn't meant to echo herself. But Martha had clearly noticed. "You've had to make a lot of differences," Martha said. Not unkindly. Just Clara looked at her. "Haven't you?" Martha Bellamy laughed a full unguarded sound. "Lord, yes," she said. She pushed off the doorframe. "I'll bring you coffee. And you're going to sit at the kitchen table for 10 minutes and eat like a human being. Not like a woman hiding from something." "I'm not hiding," Clara said. "You're sitting in this room alone doing math while the sun's shining," Martha said. "That might not be hiding to you, honey, but it looks a lot like it from out here." Clara opened her mouth, closed it, picked up her plate, and followed Martha to the kitchen. She had been at the ranch for 11 days when the first real trouble came from town. She was at the fence watching Ethan work with a young horse, a bay mare that had come to the ranch skittish and half wild, and didn't trust hands when she heard the wagon coming up the road. She turned, and the man driving it was Caleb Montgomery. Dressed well for a ranch call, smiling like he was making a social visit. Ethan didn't look up from the mare. "Colehart," Montgomery said, pulling up and stepping down from the wagon with the easy manner of a man who had never in his life been unwelcome anywhere. "Thought I'd come by personally. Heard you had a new addition to the household." His eyes moved to Clara, and he smiled. "Miss Whitlock. Good to see you again, Mr. Montgomery," she said. "I wanted to talk supply pricing." "Actually," Montgomery said, returning his attention to Ethan in the smooth way he had, the way that implied women were scenery. "I think there may have been some confusion in the last invoice." "There wasn't any confusion," Ethan said. He said it without looking up from the mare. His voice was even. Quiet. The same voice he used to talk to horses. Clara realized, low and absolutely certain. Montgomery paused. "I beg your pardon?" Now Ethan looked up. He passed the lead rope to Joe, who appeared from somewhere with the silent efficiency of a man who reads situations quickly. And he turned and put his forearms on the top fence rail and looked at Caleb Montgomery with an expression Clara couldn't quite name. Calm, mostly, but with something underneath it. "The invoice was clear," Ethan said. "So were the ones before it." Montgomery's smile didn't waver. But something behind it shifted. "I think perhaps someone has given you some incorrect information." "The information is the contracts," Ethan said. "And the receipts. And the market rates from Billings, which I wrote away for last week." A pause. "Miss Whitlock was kind enough to run the numbers." Montgomery's eyes moved to Clara. Just for a moment. Long enough for her to see, beneath the charm and the practiced ease, something sharp and cold and calculating. "I see," he said. "Do you?" Ethan said. It wasn't a question. A silence settled over the yard that had a particular texture to it, the kind that happens right before something, not right after. "I'm sure we can come to an arrangement," Montgomery said. His voice still pleasant, still smooth. "These things happen in business. Misunderstandings." "I'd like the difference," returned Ethan said. "For the last 3 years. Miss Whitlock has the exact figure." Clara said the number. She said it clearly and without preamble, because she had it memorized, and because she understood that this was the moment to say it. The number landed in the air between them. Montgomery looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant claim," he said quietly. "It's a documented one," she said. Something moved across Montgomery's face, then something that wasn't charm and wasn't anger, and wasn't anything she had a clean name for. It was the look of a man who was recalculating. "I'll be in touch," he said. He got back in his wagon. He drove away. Ethan watched him go without moving. Then he turned to look at Clara, and something in the way he did it direct, steady, with a recognition that hadn't quite been there before, made her look away at the mountains. "You didn't have to say the number," he said. "You were going to have to say it eventually," she replied. "I just saved you the step." A pause. "Then you did, Joe Carter." From the other side of the fence, made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been something else. That night at supper, something was different. It was hard to pinpoint exactly. The kitchen was the same. Martha's food was the same. Joe sat in his usual chair and told a story about Augustus the mule that meandered pleasantly toward a punchline. Clara didn't quite follow but laughed at anyway because Joe's face when he got to the end was so delighted that it was impossible not to. But Ethan talked more than he had before, not much more. He was still a quiet man in the fundamental way, the way that came from years of living alone, in a place where there was no one to talk to, and you learned to be comfortable with the sound of your own thoughts. But he asked Clara a question. "You said you'd been keeping account since you were 12, he said. "For your father's business." "That's right," she said. "What kind of business?" "Dry goods mostly, some land management." She hesitated slightly. "My father he was good at acquiring things. Not always as good at the administration, and you did that. Someone had to. What did you get out of it?" he asked. The question surprised her, not its content but its directness, the simple assumption that she should have gotten something out of it. That the exchange should have been equitable in some way. It was the kind of question that assumed she had needs. And nobody in her family had thought to ask that. "I got to be good at something," she said. After a moment. That was enough for a while. He looked at her. Was it? She met his eyes. Eventually it wasn't. Something in his face changed. Just slightly. The way light changes on a wall when a cloud moves. "I understand that," he said, and she believed him. The following Sunday, Clara made the mistake of going to church. She went because Martha asked her to, and because she hadn't been raised to stay home on Sundays, and because, if she was honest, she was beginning to feel the particular claustrophobia of a woman who spent too much time alone with her own thoughts, even when those thoughts were useful ones. The church in Harlow Creek was small and white and full of people who smiled at her in the doorway and then talked about her in the pews. She had been seated for approximately 4 minutes when she became aware that the woman directly behind her, a thin, well-dressed woman who Clara would later learn was Margaret Hale, wife of the town's most prominent banker, was speaking in the kind of low voice that is designed to be overheard. Don't understand what Colehart was thinking, bringing a woman like that out here. No family to speak of. They say ran numbers for her father's business? What kind of work is that for a woman? Clara sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked at the front of the church and did not move. The woman on her right, she turned out to be a rancher's wife named Helen Pruitt. With an air of no-nonsense competence that Clara had liked on sight, leaned slightly toward her and said, very quietly, "Don't listen to Margaret Hale. She's been mean since childhood and nobody ever told her to stop." Clara said nothing. But something in her chest loosened slightly. The service itself was fine. The problem was the afterward, the 20 minutes of socialization on the church steps that are unavoidable in small towns, where people stand in groups, and the groups shift and reform, and the new person is evaluated with the thoroughness of livestock at a fair. She was standing at the edge of the steps, looking for Martha, when Caleb Montgomery appeared at her shoulder. "Miss Whitlock," he said. He was dressed for church, well-tailored, easy-mannered, handsome in the polished way of a man who worked at it. "I owe you an apology, I think. Our conversation at the ranch was poorly handled on my part." Clara looked at him. "Was it?" she said. "I'm not accustomed to." He paused, choosing words with care. To having my accounts questioned so directly, the smile. Always the smile. It was unexpected. I should have responded more graciously. "You're welcome to return the money whenever you're ready," she said pleasantly. He laughed. "You don't forgive easily, do you?" "I don't have any particular feelings about it either way," she said. "The money isn't mine. It's Mr. Colhart's. My feelings on the subject are irrelevant." "And yet," Montgomery said. Lower now, leaning slightly, "You're the one who found it." His eyes were steady on her face. "That's an impressive skill, Miss Whitlock. A woman who can do what you can do, she could do well for herself, if she were in the right position." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I'm in a position I chose," she said. "Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Montgomery." She walked away again. She found Martha by the gate and they walked to the wagon. And Martha didn't say a word until they were out of earshot of the church. Then Martha said, "What did Montgomery want?" "To compliment me," Clara said. "In the way that people do when they're trying to learn how much you know." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Be careful with that man," she said. "He smiles like he means it." "He doesn't." "I know," Clara said. "Ethan trusted him for years," Martha said. "He'll take it hard when all this comes out." "I know that too," Clara said. And she did. She had been watching Ethan Colhart for 11 days. And she had begun to understand that beneath the quietness and the careful distance was a man who had organized his life around a very small number of things he believed in, absolutely. His land, his horses, his word, the people he allowed close. He didn't allow many people close, which meant that when they betrayed him, it cost him more than it cost most men. She turned back to look at the mountains. It was Joe who told her about Rebecca. Not intentionally. They were in the barn on a Wednesday afternoon. 2 weeks after her arrival, Joe doing something complicated with a harness, and Clara sitting on the upturned crate, going through a stack of old receipts she'd found at the back of a shelf. And they had been talking easily in the way they'd fallen into the comfortable, meandering conversation of two people who had decided to like each other without making a formal announcement of it. Joe had been telling her about the ranch's early years. The first horses Ethan brought in, the winter that nearly broke the whole operation. And somehow, without Clara quite tracking how they got there, he was talking about Rebecca. She was a school teacher, Joe said. Came out here from Ohio, took the job in Harlow Creek and ended up well. Ethan was 33, 34. He was different then. Laughed more. Joe's hands slowed on the harness. She got sick in November. By February she was gone. Clara said nothing. She had learned. With Joe, that saying nothing was often the best encouragement. He went up into the mountains for a month after, Joe said. Just him and his horses. When he came back he worked. That's what he did. He worked and he ran the ranch and he didn't. Joe shook his head. He stopped going to Sunday socials. Stopped going anywhere. Much. It wasn't he wasn't broken. He was just done. Like he'd decided that was the last time he was going to do that to himself. The last time he was going to love someone, Clara said. The last time he was going to lose someone, Joe corrected. Gently, it wasn't the love that broke him. It was the shape of the empty place she left. Clara sat with that for a while. He's been alone 8 years, she said. 8 years, Joe confirmed. Martha's here. I'm here. But we're not. He stopped. We're not people he has to open himself up to, if you understand me. We're just part of the place. Furniture. Almost, and I don't mean that badly. I mean that he doesn't have to be anything. With us. We already know what he is. Clara thought about the way Ethan had asked her about her father's business. About the directness of it. About the way he had said I understand that and meant it. He asked me questions, she said, at supper. Joe glanced at her. Did he? About my work. Why I did it. She looked at the receipt in her hand without seeing it. He seemed interested. Actually interested. Not politely interested. Ethan doesn't do polite interest, Joe said. Going back to the harness. He's either interested or he's not. There's no in-between with him. I noticed that, Clara said. Joe was quiet for a moment. Miss Whitlock, he said finally. I'm going to say something that's probably not my place. Go ahead, she said. That man in there, he nodded toward the house, has spent 8 years convincing himself that he doesn't need anybody. That he's fine. That the ranch is enough. He'd set down the harness piece he was holding. He's not fine. He's just very good at quiet suffering. Which is the kind that doesn't look like suffering from the outside. Clara was still for a long moment. I'm not here to fix him, she said. It was the same thing she'd told Joe on the first day. I know, Joe said. But sometimes the thing that helps isn't the thing that was looking to help. He picked up the harness again. Sometimes it's just the right person, sitting in the next room, doing math. Clara looked at him. Then she looked down at the receipt in her hand and then out at the summer light coming through the barn door. She didn't say anything, but something in her chest had shifted. Something quiet and careful, like a door that has been stuck a long time, and you're not sure yet if it's opening or if it's just creaking in the wind. It was the horse that broke something open between them. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, the bay mare, the skittish, half-wild one, got loose from the paddock at dusk and ended up tangled in the fence at the far edge of the property. By the time they found her, she was cut up and terrified and shaking in a way that made Clara's chest ache. Ethan was there in minutes, moving toward the mare with that slow, deliberate calm he used, rushing, no loud voices. Talking low and steady in a tone that wasn't quite words and wasn't quite not words. The kind of sound that means I am not going to hurt you and somehow crosses the barrier between human language and whatever horses understand. Clara stayed back. She watched him. He worked for a long time, long enough that the light finished dying and the stars came out. And Joe brought a lantern and then tactfully went back to the house. And it was just Ethan and the mare and Clara sitting on the fence a few feet away. Not moving, because she had learned from watching him that stillness was what the horse needed, and she had no intention of interrupting. The mare finally stopped shaking. She blew out a long breath. Ethan put his hand on her neck, very gently, and she let him. He stood there for a while with his hand on the mare's neck and his head bowed slightly. And Clara watched him and thought about what Joe had said. About the shape of the empty place. About quiet suffering. She doesn't trust easily, Clara said very quietly. No, Ethan said. She'll get there, she will. He stroked the mare's neck once more. She just needed time and someone who wasn't going to push. A pause. Is that a general philosophy? Clara asked. He turned to look at her then. Across the small distance between them, in the lantern light. He had that look again, the direct, uncalculated one she'd noticed on the first day. The one that saw. It might be, he said. Neither of them said anything else. But when they walked back to the house, they walked at the same pace. Close enough that their arms nearly touched, and the silence between them was the warm, uncomplicated kind, the kind that meant something. The letter from her father arrived 4 weeks after she did. She recognized the handwriting before she opened it. And something in her stomach clenched in the old familiar way, that automatic bracing that she'd spent 27 years developing, and didn't seem to be able to turn off. Even here, even now. She opened it in her room, sitting on the edge of her bed. It was not a long letter. Her father was not a man who believed in lengthy correspondence. It said that Violet was engaged to a young man from Nashville, which was good news for the family. It said that Josephine had had a child, a boy, which was good news for everyone. It said that he hoped she was settling in satisfactorily and that she was making herself useful. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask if she was happy. He did not say he missed her, or that the house was different without her. or any of the things that she understood now, more clearly than she ever had before, had never been part of the way her father thought about her. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. Then she folded it. She put it in the small tin box she used for personal things. She sat for another moment, and then she did something she hadn't done in years. She let herself feel the full weight of it, all of it. 27 years of being useful but not valued. Present but not seen, capable but not celebrated. The whole accumulated accumulation of it. She let herself feel it, and it was heavy, and then she let out a long, steady breath and put it away, not gone, never entirely gone, but manageable. She got up. She went back to the office. She opened the ledgers. She was so absorbed in the numbers that she didn't hear Ethan until it spoke. Clara, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She looked up, startled. He was standing in the doorway, and he was looking at her face, with the attention of a man who noticed things. And she understood immediately that he had seen something, some trace of what she'd been sitting with in her room, that she hadn't managed to put entirely away. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "I didn't ask," he said. Just that, no pressure in it. Just a quiet observation. She looked at him. He looked at her. "My father wrote," she said. After a moment. "Nothing important." "All right," he said. He didn't move. He stood in the doorway the way he did, maintaining his careful distance. Not crowding, not pushing, and he was simply there. In the particular way of someone who has decided to be present without making it a demand. And somehow that was worse than if he'd pushed. Somehow that quiet, undemanding presence undid something in her chest that she'd been holding very tightly for a very long time. "He wanted to know if I was making myself useful," she said. Before she quite decided to say it, Ethan's expression shifted. "Just slightly. What did you tell him? I haven't written back yet." A pause. "For what it's worth," Ethan said, and his voice was carefully measured. The way it got, when he meant something more than he was used to saying out loud. "Useful is the least of what you are." The words fell into the room, like something that had been dropped from a height. Clara looked at her hands on the ledger. "You hardly know me," she said. She didn't mean it unkindly, it was just the truth. "I know you've reorganized 4 years of accounts in 3 weeks," he said. "I know you spoke to Caleb Montgomery in the churchyard and sent him away without being rude. Which is more than I can say for myself. I know you sat on that fence for 2 hours in the dark because you understood the mare needed stillness more than she needed rescuing." He stopped. "I know you came here with one bag and told me you intended to be here on your own terms." Another pause. "That's not nothing, Clara." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, honest attention. And she thought about what Joe had said about Ethan not doing polite interest. About the absence of in-between. He either meant things or he didn't say them. "He meant this. Thank you," she said. "Ethan." The name sat between them for a moment. New and slightly fragile, like a thing neither of them wanted to startle. Then he nodded once and stepped back from the doorway. "Get some sleep," he said. "The Montgomery contracts aren't going anywhere." "They aren't," she agreed. He left. She sat alone in the quiet office with the lantern burning and the ledgers open and the mountains somewhere in the dark outside the window. And she thought about what it meant that a man she had known for 4 weeks had said more true things about her in 30 seconds than her father had managed in 27 years. She thought about it for a long time. And then, because she was who she was and it was what she did, she picked up her pen and went back to work. But something in the room was different. Something in her was different, small as a shift in the wind. Quiet as a door long stuck that has finally decided to open. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. That was the thing Clara had always loved about mathematics, its absolute, unfeeling honesty. You could ignore it, misread it, bury it under years of inattention, but the truth was always there. Waiting, patient as stone. She had been at the ranch for 6 weeks when she found the second set of books. She almost missed it. She would have missed it if she hadn't developed the habit of checking the back pages of every ledger she touched, a habit born from years of working with her father's accounts, where the important things were often written small and placed where you weren't looking. It was in the last ledger from 3 years ago, tucked behind the back cover, folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. A single sheet of paper with numbers on it that didn't match anything in the official accounts. She smoothed it flat on the desk and looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and went to find Ethan. He was in the paddock working with 2 of the younger ranch hands, explaining something about the fence line on the north pasture. He saw her coming, and he must have read something in her face because he excused himself immediately. And she noticed that the way he'd learned to read her, the way he noticed when something was wrong without her having to announce it. She handed him the paper without saying anything. He looked at it. His face went very still. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Back of the 1879 ledger," she said. "Behind the cover. It's been there a long time." He looked at the numbers. She watched him process them, watched the moment when understanding arrived. The way it does, not all at once, but in stages, each one landing harder than the last. "This is Montgomery's handwriting," he said. "I thought it might be," she said. "I've seen his signature on the contracts." Ethan looked up at her. "How long have you known?" "I found it an hour ago." She held his gaze. "I came to you immediately." He looked back at the paper. "These are the real prices," he said. "The prices he paid wholesale." He touched one of the figures. "And these are the prices he charged us." Yes. The difference between the 2 sets of numbers was not 20 or 30%. It was closer to 60. Ethan quiet for a long time. She waited. She had learned to wait with him, to let the silence do its work, rather than filling it with words that weren't necessary. "He's been stealing from me for 3 years, Ethan said finally. Not with rage. With something quieter and more dangerous than rage. A kind of bedrock certainty. "Yes," Clara said, "and this paper proves it." In his own hand. "I need you to make sure," he said. "I need you to go through everything again, from the beginning. Every receipt, every contract, every invoice. I need you to build a record that can't be argued with." "I'll need a week," she said. "Maybe 2. Take whatever you need." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his breast pocket, close to his chest, like something he intended to keep safe. "Clara." She looked at him. "You could have taken this to Joe," he said. "Or said nothing until you were certain." "I thought you had the right to know as soon as I knew," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment with that direct, unflinching attention of his. Then he said, "Thank you," in the voice he used when he meant something more than the words covered, and went back to his fence line. Clara went back to the ledgers. She didn't sleep much that week. Word got around, the way things did in Harlow Creek. She didn't know whether Montgomery had his own sources, whether one of the ranch hands had mentioned something in town, whether Margaret Hale had noticed the curtains move differently at the Colehart place and drawn her own conclusions. But the quality of people's attention shifted. She felt it the next time she went to collect the mail, in the way conversation stopped a beat too late to be casual, in the way Hattie Drummond handed her the letters with an expression that was trying too hard to be neutral. "Everything all right out at the ranch?" Hattie asked. "Everything's fine," Clara said. "I heard Ethan had a visitor last week." From Billings. She hadn't heard about any visitor from Billings. But she kept her face pleasant and unrevealing. "I wouldn't know about that." Hattie looked at her steadily. "You be careful," she said, the same thing Martha had said. The same thing that was starting to feel less like friendly advice and more like a warning. "I'm always careful," Clara said. She walked back to the wagon with the mail and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before taking up the reins, turning the letters over in her hands without seeing them. Something was moving in this town. She could feel it the way you feel a storm, before it arrives a change in the pressure. A particular quality to the air. She flicked the reins and headed back toward the mountains. The visitor from Billings turned out to be a lawyer. Ethan told her that evening, without preamble, in the way he'd started telling her things directly. Without softening, as if he'd decided somewhere along the way that she could be trusted with the unvarnished version. His name is Hartwell, Theodore Hartwell. He handles land disputes in the territory. Ethan set his coffee cup down on the kitchen table. I wrote to him 2 weeks ago. About Montgomery, Clara said. About Montgomery. He paused. And about the water rights. Clara went still. She set down her own cup. What water rights? He looked at her steadily. The creek that runs through the north pasture. It originates on Montgomery's land. 3 years ago, he filed a claim with the territorial office saying the water rights belonged to him. A pause. He can't legally cut the water off, not yet. But Hartwell says there are new filings. Montgomery's been making a case to redirect the creek. The room was very quiet. If he redirects the creek, Clara started. The north pasture dies, Ethan said. And without the north pasture, this ranch runs at maybe half capacity. He picked up his cup again. That's if we're lucky. Clara looked at the table. She was running numbers in her head, not because anyone had asked her to, but because that was how she thought, how she'd always thought. Translating threat into calculation, so it became something manageable. He's been overcharging you for years, she said slowly. Keeping you financially squeezed, and now he's coming for the water. She looked up at Ethan. He wants this land. He's wanted this land for a long time, Ethan said. My grandfather's claim is older than his, better situated. Better water. He said it without pride, just fact. The way he said most things. He's been trying to make me fail quietly. So he can pick up the pieces at a fraction of the value. The cold deliberateness of it settled over Clara like weather. Does Hartwell think he has a case? She asked. He says the overpricing documentation you built is strong. He says the water rights filing is trickier. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Montgomery has friends in the territorial office. How friendly. Friendly enough that Hartwell wants a federal territorial commissioner involved before we bring anything official. He looked at her. He said the accounting work was exceptional. That whoever put together the documentation understood what would be needed for a legal proceeding. Clara absorbed this. When is Hartwell coming back? 3 weeks. He's going to Billings first. To file some preliminary paperwork. Ethan turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Clara, this is going to get harder before it gets better. You understand that? I understand that, she said. Montgomery isn't going to sit still once he realizes we've moved to involve a lawyer. He said the next words carefully. Like he'd been working up to them. If you'd rather not be in the middle of this, Ethan, she said. He stopped. I found the paper, she said. I built the documentation. I am already in the middle of this. She held his gaze steadily. And I don't leave things unfinished. Something moved across his face. That shift she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he'd heard more than the literal meaning. No, he said quietly. I don't reckon you do. It was Martha who first noticed the change in Harlow Creek. She came back from the market on a Thursday, with a set expression on her face that Clara had learned to read as controlled displeasure, the look Martha wore when she was deciding how angry to be before she said what she thought. Montgomery's been talking, Martha said, coming through the kitchen door and setting her basket down harder than necessary. Clara looked up from the supply ledger she was updating. About what? About you. Martha began unpacking the basket with efficient, slightly fierce movements. He's been telling people you've been interfering with Ethan's business. That you've been making claims about the accounts that aren't founded. That you've been. She stopped, her hand still on a jar of preserves. What? Clara said. That you've been taking money yourself, Martha said. That the discrepancies in the accounts are because of you. The room was very still. Clara set down her pen. He's saying I've been stealing from Ethan, she said. He's saying it carefully, Martha said. The way he says everything. Never quite direct enough to call it a lie. Just implying. Suggesting. Letting people draw their own conclusions. Clara looked at her hands on the desk. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she didn't usually notice. How many people, she asked. Enough, Martha said. Hattie Drummond heard it. Helen Pruitt heard it. The men at the feed store heard it. She turned to look at Clara directly. By Sunday it'll be half the county. Clara sat with this. She had known something was coming. She'd felt it. But there was a difference between knowing a storm was on its way and standing in it. Where's Ethan? She asked. North Pasture. Martha came around the table and sat down across from her. And for once the older woman's brisk energy had gone quiet. She looked at Clara with an expression that Clara had seen rarely unguarded. Genuine. This is what he does, Martha said. Montgomery. When someone threatens what he has, he doesn't fight it straight. He poisons the well first. And if people believe him, Clara said, then anything I've documented becomes spect, Martha said. Yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the numbers. About the folded paper she'd found behind the ledger cover. About the 3 years of overpricing laid out in her own neat handwriting. Every figure verified, every discrepancy documented against market receipts she'd written away for. He can't make the numbers change, she said. No, Martha agreed. But he can make people doubt the person who found them. Clara stood up. I need to talk to Ethan, she said. She found him at the fence line. Exactly where Martha had said, standing with Joe looking at the creek. The afternoon was blazing, and the sky was the particular hard blue of Montana summer that she had come to find beautiful in a way that surprised her. Having grown up among the softer greens of Tennessee. She told him. She told him all of it plainly, the way she told him everything, without softening. Without building up to it, because she'd learned that he preferred directness above almost any other quality. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that Joe Carter quietly removed himself to examine the fence posts several yards away. He's lying, Ethan said. Just that. Yes, Clara said. You haven't touched a cent of anything that isn't yours. No, she said. I haven't. She looked at him. Ethan, you know that. But if people in town, I know what I know, he said. His voice had the quality of something settled and final. Like a stone wall. I watch this ranch. I watch the people on it. He turned to look at her directly. I know exactly what you have and haven't done, she breathed. Something in her chest unclenched. He's doing this to damage the documentation, she said. If it goes before Hartwell and eventually before a commissioner. And half the county is willing to testify that they heard rumors about my honesty. He needs the source discredited, Ethan said. He wasn't asking. He'd already understood it, yes. He took his hat off. Ran a hand through his hair. Put the hat back on. These were the gestures Clara had learned of a man working through something he found genuinely infuriating but intended to manage. I'm going into town tomorrow, he said. Ethan, not to argue with gossip, he said. To deposit the documentation with Hattie Drummond and have it witnessed. He looked at her. Hattie doesn't lie. If it's on record with her and dated. And witnessed. Then the story of when you started this work and what you found is established in a way that can't be muddied by whatever Montgomery is saying in feed store conversations. Clara thought about it. That's smart, she said. I have my moments, he said. And something in his voice was dry and almost amused. And the combination of that, the gravity and the faint, unexpected warmth made her look away toward the creek. I want you to come with me, he said. She looked back. Into town. Tomorrow. His voice was careful. I'm not going to let him do this without making it visible. Without showing people that I know who you are and what you've done, and that I stand behind it. She thought about the church steps. About Margaret Hale's carefully lowered voice. About the way Harlow Creek had looked at her on the first day measuring, assessing, placing her in a category. "They'll talk more," she said. "They're already talking," he said. "The only question is what they're seeing when they do." They went into town together the following morning. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat, and they rode in silence for most of the trip. The way they'd gotten comfortable doing, and she was aware of the miles passing and the mountains behind them growing smaller and the particular quality of the silence between them that had gradually, over 6 weeks, become something she looked forward to the way you look forward to warmth. Ethan stopped the wagon in front of Hattie Drummond's post office, and he got down and offered his hand, and Clara took it and stepped down. And she heard, because she had very good ears, had spent a lifetime listening for things, the sound of the conversation on the other side of the street stopping. She didn't look. She kept her eyes forward. They went inside. Hattie Drummond looked at the two of them and didn't say a word. Just reached under the counter for her notary stamp. And Clara understood that Hattie had been waiting for exactly this. Ethan laid the documentation on the counter. Clara walked Hattie through it, not quickly, not defensively, but with the measured, precise thoroughness of someone who had spent 48 hours making absolutely certain that every figure was unassailable. Hattie read every page. She asked 3 sharp questions. Clara answered all 3. When it was done, Hattie stamped and signed and dated every page, and she looked up at Clara with an expression was the closest thing to an apology that a woman like Hattie Drummond was ever going to offer her. "This is solid work," Hattie said. "I know," Clara said. They left the documentation on record and walked back out onto the street. Caleb Montgomery was standing across the road. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing outside the land office with his hands in his coat pockets, talking to another man Clara didn't recognize. But he was looking at them. At her. And even from across the street in the bright summer morning, she could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes. Ethan saw him too. For a moment, nothing happened. 2 men on opposite sides of a main street, the space between them full of everything that hadn't been said yet. Then Ethan turned to Clara and said, perfectly audibly, "You hungry?" Martha packed enough food for a small army, and the ordinary human normalcy of that, the warmth of it. The ease was so different from what the moment had threatened to be that Clara heard herself laugh. A real laugh, not careful or performed, just surprised out of her. "She always does," Clara said. They walked to the wagon. She didn't look back at Montgomery. She didn't need to. The afternoon they got back, one of the young ranch hands, a boy named Thomas, 17 in earnest, with a bad habit of delivering bad news, with the guilty expression of someone who felt responsible for it, came to find Clara in the office. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "there's a woman here. Says she needs to talk to you." Clara looked up. "Who is she?" Thomas shifted his weight. "Says her name is Grace. Says she's your sister." The pen dropped out of Clara's hand. She picked it up. She set it down deliberately. She stood. Violet was the sister she'd imagined might write, might feel something about her departure, might even, in the best version of things, miss her in the vague, uncomplicated way sisters did when they hadn't been rivals for the same scraps of attention. But Violet was getting married in Nashville and had other things on her mind. It was Grace who came, Grace who was 24, 3 years younger than Clara, and who had always been the one in the middle, not beautiful enough to be Violet and not invisible enough to be Clara, occupying that uncomfortable in-between space of someone who had watched the way things worked in the Whitlock household and wasn't sure she liked it, but wasn't sure she had the standing to say so. Clara walked out of the office. Grace was standing in the main hall, looking around with the wide, slightly overwhelmed expression of a woman who had traveled a very long way and wasn't sure she'd had the right idea, but had come anyway. She was thinner than Clara remembered. Her dress was travel-worn. She had their mother's nose and their father's jaw, and an expression on her face that Clara had never seen there before, something raw and uncertain and very young. Clara, she said. Grace, Clara said. They looked at each other across the hall. You didn't write, Grace said. You didn't either, Clara pointed out. Grace's face did something complicated. I wanted to. I didn't know. She stopped. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what you'd. Then, in a rush, Father got a letter from someone here. Someone named Montgomery. She pressed her lips together. He said you'd been stealing, that you were causing trouble and embarrassing the family, and that we ought to come and bring you home before. Montgomery wrote to my father, Clara said. The words were perfectly calm. She said them the way you say something you need to hear out loud to fully understand. He said the family should know, Grace said, watching her. Clara, I didn't believe it. I told Father I didn't believe it. I said you would never, but he was going to come himself, and I thought. She exhaled. I thought it would be better if it was me. Clara looked at her sister for a long moment. He wrote to my father, she said again, still calm. To bring me home. Father was furious, Grace said. You know how he gets. He started talking about the Whitlock name and Grace, Clara said. Grace stopped. I'm not going home, Clara said. Her sister blinked. Clara, I'm not going home. Her voice was even. Certain. Not angry, just settled, in the way of a thing that has been decided and doesn't need to be argued about. Whatever Montgomery told my father, whatever he's been telling this town, I have done nothing wrong. I've done my work, I've kept my word. She held her sister's eyes steadily. And I'm not leaving. Grace stared at her then. Slowly, something in her sister's face changed. The uncertainty was still there, but underneath it. Something that might have been, if you watched carefully. Relief. You seem different, Grace said, than when you left. Do I? Clara said. Yes. Grace looked around the hall again, at the clean, solid lines of the house. The light coming through the windows, the quiet, purposeful order of a place that was being well cared for. You seem like you know where you are. Clara thought about that. I do, she said, for the first time in a long time. I do. She introduced Grace to Martha, who took one look at the girl's travel-worn state and produced food with the automatic efficiency of someone whose instinct in any situation was to begin with feeding people. She introduced her to Joe, who tipped his hat and told her she had a good sister, with the simple directness of a man who said what he thought. And then, because there was no way around it, she introduced her to Ethan. He came in from the paddock in the early evening, hat in hand. And he looked at Grace the way he looked at most things he encountered unexpectedly, directly. Without fuss, assessing without judgment. Miss Whitlock, he said. Mr. Colehart. Grace's voice was slightly nervous. She'd clearly been prepared for something other than a quiet man, with a steady expression and the manners of someone who had decided long ago that courtesy cost nothing. You came a long way, he said. Ah, yes, Grace said. He nodded. He looked at Clara, and in that look was a question and an offer. Both at once. Do you want me here, or do you need the room? She had learned to read him. Stay, she said. Just the one word. He sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and said nothing more. And his presence in the room was the kind that didn't crowd anything, just anchored it. The way a good fence post anchors a line. Grace told the full story over supper. Montgomery's letter had arrived in Tennessee 3 weeks ago. Horace Whitlock had read it and immediately begun composing a letter of his own to the territorial office. To a lawyer, to anyone who would confirm that his daughter's behavior was bringing embarrassment to the Whitlock name. Grace had intercepted 2 of those letters. She had argued with her father for 10 days, the first time in her life she could remember arguing with him about anything, and when she'd realized she wasn't going to stop him with words, she'd bought her own ticket and come west. He'll still write, Grace said. Father. He'll still try to do something, let him, Clara said. Clara, the documentation is notarized and on record with the postmistress, Clara said. Whatever Montgomery has told him is a lie, and the truth is now provably established. Father can write whatever he wants. Grace looked at her. Then she looked at Ethan, who was watching Clara, with an expression that Grace would describe later. To herself, in the quiet of the small room Martha had prepared for her, as the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised by someone and started being grateful. When did you become? Grace started. I didn't become anything, Clara said. I was always this. Nobody was looking. The table was quiet. Then Joe Carter cleared his throat and said, She's right. You know, I noticed it on the first day, and Martha said, I noticed it in the first hour, and Ethan said nothing at all. But when Clara looked at him across the table, he held her eyes for a moment. And in that moment, she saw what she'd been too careful to look for directly, something that had been building for 6 weeks in the space between work and silence, and hands almost touching, and words that meant more than they said. She looked away. She picked up her fork, but her heart was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. Something warm and frightening, and exactly right. It came apart 4 days later. She should have seen it coming. In retrospect, she had seen the pieces of it, the way Montgomery had gone quiet after the notarization, the way his usual easy presence in town had become less visible, the way one of the ranch hands had mentioned seeing an unfamiliar wagon on the road near the north pasture. She'd registered all of it and filed it under Montgomery as recalculating, and had continued her work. She had not understood that a man who had been stealing quietly for 3 years was not going to accept exposure quietly. She was in the office on a Friday morning when she heard the horses. Multiple horses coming fast up the road. She was at the window before she knew she'd stood up. And what she saw was Caleb Montgomery and 2 men she didn't recognize, and behind them, the wagon that carried the Harlow Creek deputy sheriff. She walked out to meet them. She didn't run. She didn't get Ethan first. She walked out because whatever was coming, she intended to face it on her feet. Montgomery stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch. He was still wearing the smile. It had a different quality to it now, thinner, colder, the layer of charm worn down to something more honest underneath. Miss Whitlock, he said. Mr. Montgomery, she said. The deputy, a young man named Carlyle, who had the look of someone who sincerely wished he were somewhere else, dismounted with the stiff formality of a man doing something he wasn't sure about. I'm sorry, Miss Whitlock, he said, and he sounded like he meant it. Mr. Montgomery has filed a complaint with the sheriff's office. He reached into his coat. He's alleging that $140 was removed from the ranch's operating account without authorization. He held out a document. He's named you as the responsible party. Clara looked at the document. She did not take it. That's not possible, she said. I don't have access to the operating account. The ranch accounts, Carlyle said. Unhappily. I know what he says, Clara said. Her voice was calm. She was aware of how her hands were hanging at her sides, loose and steady, and she was glad of it. I want you to note, Deputy, that I am telling you directly. I have not removed a single dollar from any account associated with this ranch. She met Carlyle's eyes. I want that noted. It's noted, Carlyle said. But I'm required to investigate, Miss Whitlock. You understand. She heard boots on the porch behind her. Ethan. He came to stand beside her, close, not in front of her. Not between her and the situation, but beside, shoulder to shoulder. Carlyle, he said, Mr. Colhart. Carlyle looked genuinely miserable now. I'm sorry to bring this to your door. You're doing your job, Ethan said. What does the investigation require? I need to look at the accounts, Carlyle said. And he hesitated. I need Miss Whitlock to come into town. For questioning. The word hung in the air. Clara felt, from the direction of the barn, the presence of Joe and Martha and Grace, who had come out at the sound of the horses and were standing very still. The whole ranch felt very still. Montgomery sat on his horse with his careful smile and said nothing. Clara turned to Ethan. He was looking at her, not at Montgomery. Not at Carlyle. Not at the document in the deputy's hand. At her. Every ledger, every receipt, every invoice from the day I arrived, she said steadily. Take them all. Let him look at everything. Ethan looked at her for one more moment. Then he said to Carlyle, "You'll have full access to the accounts. Every document we have." His voice was granite quiet. "And then we'll talk about what Montgomery has been doing to these accounts for 3 years." Montgomery's smile flickered. Just for a moment. Just enough. Carlyle looked between them. "I'll be back Monday," he said, with the full paperwork. He mounted up. He rode away. Montgomery looked at Clara one last time. And in that look was something she recognized, because she had seen versions of it her whole life, the look of someone who had just realized that the person they'd dismissed was not, in fact, dismissible. He turned his horse and rode after Carlyle. The dust settled. Joe said somewhere behind her, "Well." Martha said, "Come inside, all of you," but Clara stood on the porch a moment longer, breathing the hot summer air, feeling the mountain at her back and the town in front of her, and the whole weight of what was pressing down on the afternoon, like weather. She had come here with one bag and no promises. She had said she intended to be here on her own terms. She had meant it then. She meant it now more than she ever had. The weekend before Deputy Carlyle was due back was the longest 2 days Clara had ever spent. Not because she was afraid of what the accounts would show. She knew exactly what they would show. She had built every page of the documentation herself, verified every figure twice, cross-referenced every receipt against every ledger entry, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that the truth only protects you if you can prove it. The numbers were clean. Her numbers were always clean. What kept her awake was something else entirely. It was the town. She had gone into Harlow Creek on Saturday morning to collect a package Joe was expecting. And what she encountered was the particular, suffocating silence of a community that has made up its mind. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough to create that invisible wall of turned shoulders and conversations that stopped a half-second too late. Enough to make the air feel different the moment she stepped down from the wagon. Helen Pruitt had nodded to her from across the street, which was something. Hattie Drummond had been pointedly, deliberately normal, asking after Martha and commenting on the weather, which was more than something. But Margaret Hale had walked past her on the boardwalk without acknowledging her existence. And the 2 women outside the milliner's shop had watched her with the particular expression of people who have been told a story and found it satisfying. She bought what she needed. She walked back to the wagon. She held herself together with both hands all the way out of town. And it was only when Harlow Creek was a mile behind her and the mountains were ahead that she let herself feel the full, familiar weight of it. She had spent 27 years being overlooked, being dismissed, being the one who didn't quite fit the category people had prepared for her. She had thought, somewhere in the back of her careful mind, that here at this ranch, at this distance from everything that had shaped her, she might finally be somewhere that didn't require her to prove herself against other people's predetermined conclusions. She had been foolish. People carried their conclusions with them wherever they went. And small towns had very long memories and very little patience for women who didn't fit the expected shapes. She got back to the ranch and went directly to the office and closed the door. She was sitting at the desk, not working, just sitting. When Martha, Clara said. Martha came in, looked at her, and sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited. This was new. Martha had always maintained a slight, respectful distance in the office, treating it as Clara's domain. The fact that she came in and sat down without ceremony told Clara that Martha had already decided something. "Tell me," Martha said. "It's fine," Clara said. "It's not fine," Martha said. "Your face looks like it did when you read that letter from your father." Clara looked at her hands. "The town has decided," she said. "It doesn't matter what the accounts show. They've already made up their minds. Some of them," Martha said. Enough of them. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been in this valley for 14 years. I cooked for 3 different families before I came here. I've watched this town decide things about people more times than I can count. She folded her hands on the desk. You know what I've noticed? Clara looked at her. Towns change their minds when the person they've decided about doesn't leave, Martha said. What they can't tolerate isn't the accusation. It's the accused person standing up straight and staying put. She held Clara's eyes. Montgomery is counting on you to go. That's the whole plan. He poisons the well enough that you decide it's not worth the fight. And you pack your one bag and get on a stagecoach, and he wins without ever having to prove anything. Clara sat with that. If I stay, she said slowly, and the investigation goes badly, it won't go badly, Martha said, with the calm certainty of a woman who had read the accounts herself over Clara's shoulder on more than one evening. The numbers are the numbers. They don't care what Margaret Hale thinks. Clara was quiet for a long moment. I told Ethan I don't leave things unfinished, she said. I know you did, Martha said. I was in the kitchen. The walls in this house aren't as thick as they look. She stood up, smoothed her apron. Don't leave, Clara. Not because of those people. You've already given enough ground to people who didn't deserve it. She left. Clara sat alone in the quiet office after a while. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Ethan found her there 2 hours later. He came in without knocking. He'd started doing that about a week ago. And she'd noticed the shift, the way it marked a change in the category they occupied for each other. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her. Martha told me you went to town, he said. I did, she said without looking up. And she set down her pen. She looked at him. Montgomery has done his work, she said. I won't pretend otherwise. He came in then, fully, and sat in the chair across from her the same way Martha had, without asking, as if he'd decided that the formality of asking was no longer necessary between them. He put his hat on his knee and looked at her directly. Does it change anything, he asked. She understood what he was really asking. Not whether the town's opinion changed the facts of the case. Whether it changed her. No, she said, it doesn't change anything. He nodded. Just once. The nod of a man who had been hoping for a particular answer and received it. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I went to see Hartwell today, he said. In Billings. I rode out yesterday and came back this morning. He paused. I didn't tell you I was going, because I didn't want to. He stopped, pressed his lips together briefly, the gesture of a man working out how to say something he isn't used to saying. I didn't want you to feel like you had to come, like you had to be involved in something that's already cost you enough. Clara looked at him. Ethan, she said carefully, I am already involved. He turned his hat on his knee. But there's a difference between being involved and being the one who takes the hit every time. The room was very quiet. What did Hartwell say? She asked. He's filed with the Federal Territorial Commissioner's Office, Ethan said. Based on the documentation you put together. The overpricing. The contract clause, the water rights filing, all of it. He paused. He said the case is strong. He said the accounting work, as he used the word, impeccable. Clara absorbed this. He also said, Ethan continued, that Montgomery's theft complaint against you is likely a tactical move to create a competing narrative. To muddy the record before the commissioner gets here. He met her eyes steadily. The commissioner is coming, Clara, to Harlow Creek. Within the month. The weight of that settled over the room. When this is over, Ethan said, and his voice changed slightly, still even. Still measured, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. I want to talk to you. About what comes next. She looked at him. What do you mean? He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she could hear the horses in the paddock and the distant sound of Joe doing something with the fence. I mean, he said that I had a plan for this ranch. For my life. A plan that was mostly about working and not needing anything beyond what was already here. He looked at his hat. Then at her. I think that plan was wrong. Clara's heart did the thing it had been doing increasingly often in his presence, that warm, frightening, inexplicable tightening. Ethan, she said. We should get through Monday first. He looked at her. For a moment, something in his expression was almost frustrated, the look of a man who has been quiet for 8 years and has finally found the words and is being asked to put them away again. But then it passed, and what replaced it was something steadier. Something patient. All right, he said, Monday first. He stood up. He put his hat on. He paused at the door. For what it's, he said. Not turning around, his voice carrying the particular weight of words that have been thought about for a while before being said. I don't care what this town decides, I know who you are. He left. Clara sat very still for a long time. Then she pressed both hands flat on the desk, looked at the ledgers in front of her, and breathed. Monday, she told herself. Get through Monday. Monday came with the particular brightness of a Montana summer morning that has no patience for what you're dreading. Deputy Carlyle arrived at 9 with 2 men from the sheriff's office and an expression that was trying very hard to be official and wasn't quite managing it. He was, Clara had decided, a fundamentally decent young man placed in an indecent situation. And she had made the decision over the weekend to treat him accordingly. She had the accounts laid out on the long table in the main room. Every ledger, every receipt, every invoice, every piece of correspondence. All of it organized chronologically, cross-referenced. With a separate summary document she'd written that evening that walked through every figure in plain. Clear language designed to be understood by someone who was not an accountant. She had also, on an impulse she hadn't entirely analyzed, prepared a second document, a complete timeline of every transaction she had personally been responsible for since arriving at the ranch, with the corresponding documentation for each one. Every penny accounted for, every decision explained. Carlyle looked at the table. He looked at it for a long moment. You did all this over the weekend, he said. I did, she said. Miss Whitlock, he said, quietly enough that his 2 companions couldn't hear. I want you to know that I am doing my job, that's all I'm doing. Whatever Montgomery told Sheriff Briggs, he stopped. I'm just following the complaint. That's all. I understand that, she said. That's why everything you need is on that table. He spent 3 hours going through it. His 2 men spent the same 3 hours going through the operating accounts with Joe, who answered every question with the patient, methodical directness of a man who has nothing to hide and has lived long enough to the difference between authority and righteousness. Ethan was in and out. He didn't hover, he came through twice. Asked Carlyle once if he needed anything, and otherwise stayed out of the room in the way of a man who understood that the best thing he could do was let the work speak. At noon, Martha brought food and nobody argued with her. At noon, Carlyle sat back from the table and rubbed his face with both hands. There's nothing here, he said. No, Clara said. There isn't. The $140 Montgomery claims is missing. Is in the operating account, Clara said. She turned to the relevant page of the summary document and pointed. It was transferred from the operating account to the supply fund on September 3rd. To cover a payment for the harness repair that Joe authorized. She looked at Carlyle. Joe's signature is on the authorization. The receipt from the harness maker in Billings is clipped to the back of this page. She turned the page to show him. The money was never missing. It was moved. Carlyle looked at the receipt. He looked at Joe's signature. Then he looked at the date on the receipt. This is dated 3 weeks before Montgomery filed the complaint, he said. Yes, Clara said, it is. The room was quiet. He knew the money wasn't missing, Carlyle said. Not a question. He knew exactly where the money was, Clara said. Because he supplied the harness maker. It's in the ledger. The transaction went through Montgomery's company. Carlyle stared at her. He filed a theft complaint, Carlyle said slowly. About money he knew was in an account he could see the record of. Because the payment went through his own business. Yes, Clara said. And because she was who she was, and because she had been raised to be accurate rather than dramatic. She added, Deputy, I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to do anything except note what the documentation shows. What you do with that information is entirely your decision. Carlyle put his hat on. He took it off again. He looked at the tablefuls of accounts and then at Clara and then at the hat in his hands. I'm going to need to file a report with the sheriff. I'd expect nothing less, she said. He left at 2 o'clock, his 2 men left with him. And the sound of the horses going back down the road towards town was the most satisfying sound Clara had heard in a very long time. She stood at the window and listened until they were gone. Then Ethan was there. She felt him before she heard him. The way she'd gotten used to that particular quality of presence, solid and quiet, that she'd come to find she was always aware of. Even when he was at the other end of the house. Well, he said. She turned. He found nothing. Because there's nothing to find. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he let out a long, slow breath, and in that breath was 8 weeks of tension releasing. The account was always clean, she said. I knew it was, he said. You didn't waver, she said. Not accusing, just noting. Even when Montgomery filed the complaint. Even when Carlyle showed up. You didn't, I told you, he said. I know what I know. She looked at him across the room. Most people, she said, carefully, when someone they've known for 6 weeks is accused of something. Most people don't pay attention, he said. He held her eyes steadily. I pay attention, I always have. I stopped using what I noticed. For a long time. I stopped letting it matter. He paused. You noticed the mayor. You noticed when Joe was tired before Joe noticed it himself. You left the accounts for my father's business on the desk when you left Tennessee, even though you owed him nothing. He stopped. Clara, I know who you are. I've known for a long time. She stood very still. Ethan, she said. I know, he said. Monday first. We got through Monday. A pause. Yes, she said. We did. The federal territorial commissioner arrived on a Thursday. His name was Arthur Beaumont, and he was not what Harlow Creek expected. He was a small, precise man of about 60, with the particular economy of movement of someone who has learned to get a great deal done without wasting energy on performance. He arrived with 1 assistant, took a room at the town's single boarding house, and within 4 hours of arriving had sent written requests to the sheriff's office, the land records office, the post office, and the Colhart Ranch. He came to the ranch the following morning. Clara met him at the door. She had been awake since 4 preparing. Not the documentation that was already done. Already organized, already notarized and witnessed. She had been reviewing it, going through it one final time the way you go through something you've built before you show it to the person who will decide its worth. Looking for gaps. Looking for anything she might have missed. She had found nothing. She had expected to find nothing. But she had looked anyway, because that was who she was. Commissioner Beaumont walked through the documentation with her for 3 hours. He asked questions precise, pointed questions that went straight to the center of what he needed to understand. No circling, no preamble. She answered everyone. She showed him every receipt. Every contract, every ledger page, every piece of correspondence. She showed him the folded paper she'd found, behind the back cover of the 1,879 ledger. Still in Montgomery's handwriting, now enclosed in a paper sleeve she'd made to protect it. He held that paper for a long time. You found this behind the ledger cover, he said. Yes, sir, she said. Months into your employment here. 6 weeks, she said. I started from the beginning and went through everything systematically. He looked at the paper. And you brought this immediately to Mr. Colhart. Within the hour, he set the paper down carefully. He looked at her over the edge of his spectacles with the calm Thorough attention of a man who had spent 30 years in his profession and had developed a very reliable instinct for the difference between a story and the truth. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "in your assessment, and I am asking for your assessment, because you are evidently in the best position to give one. How long has this been occurring?" "The overpricing began 3 years ago," she said. "Gradually, which is how it evaded notice. The water rights filing is more recent. I believe that's the second stage of what Mr. Montgomery intended. Make the ranch financially unsustainable through inflated costs, then acquire the water rights, then offer to buy the land at a distressed price." She paused. "It's a patient strategy. It would have worked eventually, if the accounts had continued to go unexamined." Beaumont nodded slowly. "And the theft complaint filed against you?" "Was filed after we notarized the documentation," she said. "After Mr. Colhart wrote to Mr. Hartwell. After Mr. Montgomery understood that the strategy was becoming visible. She kept her voice neutral. The money he claimed was missing was never missing. The deputy's investigation confirmed that. Beaumont took his spectacles off and polished them thoughtfully. "You are a remarkably methodical woman, Miss Whitlock. I was taught that numbers don't lie." "Commissioner," she said, "I've spent my life proving it." He put his spectacles back on. "I believe you have." The hearing was held at the Harlow Creek Courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Clara had not expected the town to come. She had underestimated, apparently, small-town appetite for consequence for the satisfaction of seeing things resolved, even if the resolution required revising what you had decided to believe. The courthouse was full. She sat beside Hartwell at the table on the left. Across from them, Montgomery sat with his own lawyer, a man brought from Billings who had the overdressed, slightly nervous look of someone who had arrived expecting a manageable situation and was beginning to revise that assessment. Commissioner Beaumont sat at the front. Ethan sat in the row behind Clara. He had Joe on one side and Grace on the other, and Martha behind them, and the collective presence of them at her back was something she was more aware of than she had expected to be. She had told herself, coming in, that it didn't matter, that what mattered was the documentation, that she had never needed anyone at her back before, and she didn't need it now. She had been wrong about that, she realized. It did matter. Not because she needed it to survive, she would have survived without it, but because it was the difference between surviving and not being alone while you did. Beaumont called the hearing to order. The first hour was procedure filings. Documentation entered into record, attorneys making statements. Clara listened carefully and said nothing. Hartwell had told her to speak only when asked directly, and she was good at following instructions when the instructions made sense. Montgomery's lawyer made his case with the polished confidence of a man who has been paid a great deal to make things sound reasonable. He spoke about market fluctuations, about the complexity of pricing in the territory, about how a woman with no formal accounting education, he said this without looking at Clara, which she noted could easily misinterpret figures that required professional expertise to understand. Clara kept her face very still. Beaumont let the lawyer finish. Then he said, "Mr. Hartwell, your response." Hartwell stood. He was a dry, understated man who had the gift of making complicated things sound simple. He walked through the documentation, the price differentials, the market comparisons, the contract clause, the folded paper found behind the ledger cover with the calm, methodical precision of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly which facts were load-bearing. Then he said, "Commissioner, I would like to call Miss Whitlock to speak." Clara stood. She walked to the front of the room. She turned to face Beaumont, and behind him the full courthouse of Harlow Creek. She saw Helen Pruitt in the third row. Helen gave her a small, firm nod. She saw Hattie Drummond in the fifth row, arms crossed, with the expression of a woman waiting for justice to arrive at a conclusion she has been expecting. She saw Margaret Hale near the back, with an expression that was no longer certain. She saw Caleb Montgomery at his table, and he was looking at her with something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the charm, not the cold calculation, something rawer than either. She looked away from him. She looked at Beaumont. "Miss Whitlock," Beaumont said. In your own words, she spoke for 20 minutes. She did not use notes. She didn't need to. The numbers were as familiar to her as her own name. She walked through every discrepancy, every verified comparison, every piece of documentation with the clear, unhurried precision of someone who has spent a lifetime making sure she could prove what she knew. She didn't perform. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth in the most orderly way she knew how. When she finished, the courthouse was quiet. Beaumont said, "Mr. Montgomery's counsel, do you wish to cross-examine?" A pause. Montgomery's lawyer stood. He asked 4 questions. Clara answered all 4 with the relevant page number of the documentation. The lawyer sat back down. Beaumont looked over his spectacles at the room. Then he looked at the documentation in front of him. Then he said, without particular inflection, as if he were noting that it was Tuesday, "The evidence in this matter is not ambiguous." The verdict took less time than Clara had expected. Beaumont found for the ranch on every count. The water rights filing was nullified pending a territorial review. Montgomery was ordered to return the 3 years of overcharging the full amount, plus the fees for Hartwell's work. The theft complaint against Clara was formally and publicly dismissed. The folded paper in Montgomery's handwriting was entered as evidence of deliberate fraud and referred to the territorial prosecutor's office. Montgomery sat very still while Beaumont read all of this. His lawyer wrote things down. The easy manner, the practiced smile, the particular quality of confidence that had let him walk through Harlow Creek, like a man who expected the world to arrange itself around his plans, all of it was gone. What was left was a man sitting in a chair, looking at the consequence of what he'd decided other people would never notice. Clara looked at him once, just once. He'd decided she was nobody. He'd decided that a plain woman with a ledger was not a threat worth taking seriously. He had been wrong. She turned away. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon was blazing hot, and the street was full of people, and nobody quite knew how to manage the transition from the charged atmosphere inside to the ordinary summer afternoon outside. Helen Pruitt found Clara first. "Miss Whitlock," she said, and her voice was direct and unembarrassed. "I want you to know that I never believed a word of what was being said. And I want to apologize that I didn't say so louder. You nodded to me when I walked in," Clara said. That was enough. Helen looked at her steadily. "It wasn't," she said. "But I appreciate you saying so." Then Hattie Drummond was there, with the crisp efficiency of a woman who had been waiting to say something and was now going to say it. "I've been postmistress in this town for 11 years, Hattie said. "I've seen people come and go, and I've seen the way this community treats people it decides don't fit." She looked at Clara without flinching. "We didn't do right by you. A good portion of this town made up its mind before it had any business doing so. And that's a thing we're going to have to sit with." She extended her hand. "You did exceptional work, Miss Whitlock. This town owes you an accounting of its own." Clara shook her hand. Then Grace was there, and Grace grabbed both her hands and held them. And her sister's face was doing several things at once, relief and pride and something else. Something more complicated, that Clara recognized because she had seen it in herself. "You were magnificent," Grace said. "You were Clara. You were—" "I just told the truth," Clara said. "You told it like it was worth telling," Grace said. "Like you had every right in the world to say it out loud." Her grip on Clara's hands tightened. "I've never," voice caught slightly. "I've never seen you like that before." "You weren't looking before," Clara said. She said it gently. Grace's face did something that looked very much like tears trying to be managed. "No," she said quietly, "I wasn't." Clara squeezed her sister's hands once and then let go. Because there was someone else behind Grace. Ethan. He was standing a few feet back, hat in hand, waiting with the patience she'd come to know as fundamentally his, not passive. Not uncertain, just unwilling to push himself into a space that wasn't yet his to enter. She walked toward him. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. Direct. Seeing. Well, he said. Well, she said. You were something in there, he said. His voice was quiet. Not performing, just saying what was true. You said you'd get through Monday, she said. We got through more than Monday, we did. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. Clara, that thing I said I wanted to talk to you about. She waited. I don't want to run this ranch alone anymore, he said. It came out plainly, the way his important things always did, without softening. Without a preamble designed to make it easier to say. I've been alone on that land for 8 years. I thought I wanted it that way. I thought the alone was the point. He looked at her steadily. And then you came into my office and told me you had numbers to look at, and you said you intended to be here on your own terms. And something in me, he stopped. Something I thought I'd finished feeling started feeling again. The street around them continued its ordinary afternoon life. Horses and voices and the sound of Harlow Creek going on without asking permission. Clara looked at him. This man, this quiet, complicated, fundamentally honest man who had given her the first space in her entire life, where the thing she was had been not just tolerated but needed. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know, he said. But I want you to stay because you want to. Not because there's nowhere else. He held her eyes. Is there a difference? For you? She thought about her father's kitchen. About the letter in her apron pocket on a Tuesday morning. About Grace saying you seem like you know where you are. And her own voice answering for the first time in her life. Yes, she said. There's a difference. Then I'm asking, he said. Not for a housekeeper. Not for someone to manage the accounts. He held his hat still in his hands. I'm asking for you to stay. He paused. All of it, if you want that. The summer air pressed around them warm and certain. Ethan, she said. Yes, I do, she said. Want that? Something happened in his face then, something that had been carefully, patiently contained for a very long time, released its hold. He didn't sweep her up or make a speech about it. He was not that kind of man. And she would not have wanted him to be. He reached out and took her hand. Simply the way he did most things, without performance. Without excess, with absolute intention. She let him. They stood on the Harlow Creek street in the blazing summer afternoon, with the mountains at the edge of the sky, and the whole complicated, honest truth of the last 8 weeks around them. And it was not a fairy story. And it was not simple, and it was not without cost. But it was real. And for Clara May Whitlock, who had spent 27 years being told that real was not something she was entitled to want, that was everything. They rode home in the afternoon, with Grace on the back of the wagon and Joe up front, with Martha and the mountains getting larger as Harlow Creek got smaller behind them. And nobody said much because nobody needed to. Joe started a story about Augustus the mule. Martha interrupted 3 times to correct details she couldn't possibly have known. Grace laughed a real uncalculated laugh that Clara hadn't heard from her sister in years. And Ethan sat beside Clara on the seat with his shoulder against hers and his eyes on the road. And once, without looking at her, without saying anything at all, he turned his hand over on the seat between them, palm up. She put her hand in his. Simple as that. Simple as the mountains. Simple as the truth. The ranch came into view as the sun began its long western drop. And the horses picked up their pace, the way horses do when they smell home. And Clara felt something she had no name for, that was large and warm and entirely unfamiliar. Then she realized she did have a name for it. She just hadn't felt it in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was. It was exactly what it had always been, patient and quiet. Waiting for her to arrive somewhere worthy of it. It was belonging. The morning after the hearing, Clara woke before dawn. She lay still for a moment in the quiet of her room, listening to the ranch breathe the horses moving in the paddock, the distant sound of wind in the timber on the upper slope, the particular settled silence of a house where people are sleeping without fear. She had learned to read the ranch's sounds the way she read ledgers. Every entry meaningful, every pattern telling a story. This morning the story was peace. She got up. She dressed in the dark. She went to the office, not because there was urgent work for the first time in 8 weeks. The most pressing things were resolved, the documentation filed, the verdict given, the threat contained. She went because the office had become the place where she thought most clearly, where the particular combination of paper and numbers and morning quiet allowed her mind to settle into its best version of itself. She sat at the desk. She opened the ledger that was current, the one she'd been building since she arrived. The clean record of a ranch whose accounts were finally honest. She ran her finger down the columns. Everything added up. Everything was where it was supposed to be. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. She thought about her father's kitchen on a Tuesday morning, about the letter propped against the sugar bowl, about the way she had pressed it against her chest with both hands to keep from shaking apart. She thought about how far that Tuesday was from this one. She heard boots in the hall. Ethan appeared in the doorway, already dressed, holding 2 cups of coffee. He looked at her sitting at the desk in the pre-dawn dark with the lamp lit and the ledger open, and he didn't ask why she was up at this hour because he had stopped asking questions whose answers he already understood. He set 1 cup on the desk in front of her. He sat in the chair across from her. They drank their coffee in the quiet morning, the 2 of them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. And the silence was the warm, undemanding kind that only exists between people who have gotten through something hard together and come out the other side still choosing each other. "I was thinking," Ethan said eventually. "I know," she said. "I can tell." "Can you?" "You get a particular look," she said. "Around the eyes. Like you're working through something you're not sure how to say." He was quiet for a moment. "Then that's unsettling. You'll get used to it," she said. Something in his face softened, not a smile exactly, but the thing that happened before one. "I was thinking about the North Pasture," he said. "Now that the water rights filing is nullified, we can run more cattle up there next season. The creek's been underused because I didn't want to expand into land that might not stay mine." He turned his cup in his hands. "But it's mine. It was always mine. It was always yours," she agreed. "I want to hire 2 more hands," he said. "I want to put a proper fence along the creek boundary so there's no ambiguity about the line. And he stopped. "I want to fix the books properly. Going forward, with a real system." "The books are already fixed," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to make sure they stay that way." He looked at her directly. "I want you to build the system. Your way. Whatever makes sense to you." Clara held her coffee cup and looked at him across the desk. This man who had handed her a cup of coffee in the dark and talked about fence lines and account systems the morning after she had publicly dismantled the scheme that had threatened everything he owned. This man who showed love the way he showed most things, through attention, through trust, through the steady accumulation of small, unperformative choices. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They went back to their coffee. Outside, the first light was beginning. Grace came to find her after breakfast. She had been at the ranch for nearly 2 weeks now, sleeping in the small room Martha had prepared for her, helping in the kitchen, and with the mending and with the particular chaotic energy of a woman who has made a decision she hasn't fully announced yet. Clara had been watching her sister move through the days with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read people the way she read numbers, and she thought she understood what Grace was working up to. She was right. "I'm thinking of staying," Grace said. She said it in the barn, where Clara was checking over the supply receipt she'd just signed, which was probably not coincidental, Grace had learned. In 2 weeks, That the barn was where difficult conversations happened most naturally. Because horses were good for absorbing silences. Clara set down the receipt. In Harlow Creek, in Montana, Grace said, I wrote to a woman in Billings who runs a boarding house. She's looking for someone to help manage it. Grace's voice was careful. The way it got when she was being brave about something. I have good skills. I can cook. I can manage people. A pause. I watched you this past week, and I thought if you could do what you did, then maybe I could, Clara said. Her sister stopped. You don't need to compare yourself to what I did, Clara said. What you did coming out here, arguing with father for 10 days. Buying your own ticket that was yours, that was you. She held her sister's eyes. Don't make it about me. Grace blinked. Something in her face shifted, uncertain. Then settling. Father's going to be furious, Grace said. He's going to be furious regardless, Clara said. He's been furious since I didn't come home when Montgomery wrote to him. She paused. Have you heard from him? He wrote to me, Grace said. 2 days ago. She pressed her lips together. He said that you had embarrassed the family and that it was our fault for not handling things properly and that he expected us both home by October. Clara looked at the receipt in her hand. Are you going? She asked. Grace looked at her for a long moment. No, she said, and then as if the word had opened something. No, I'm not. She straightened slightly. I'm 24 years old and I am tired of being in a house where the best thing I can do is become invisible. Her voice didn't shake. You taught me that. In 2 weeks, watching you, you taught me that. Clara felt something in her chest that was complex and warm and slightly painful, in the way that things are when they've been waited for too long. I'll write to the woman in Billings, Clara said. Hartwell knows people there. He can vouch for you. Grace stared at her. You'd do that? You're my sister, Clara said. Of course I'd do that. She picked up the receipt again. And write to father yourself. Don't let me do it for you. Say what you want to say. Grace nodded. She turned to go. Then she stopped. Clara, she said, are you happy? The question landed in the barn with all the weight of 27 years behind it. Clara thought about the coffee in the dark, about the ledger that added up, about a man who had learned to read her silences and had started turning his palm up on wagon seats. Yes, she said, for the first time in a long time. I am. Grace smiled a full, unguarded smile that Clara hadn't seen from her sister since they were children. Good, Grace said. You should have been happy years ago. I know, Clara said. But maybe I needed to find the right place to be it. The letter from the territorial prosecutor's office arrived on a Wednesday. It was addressed to Ethan, but he brought it directly to Clara, unopened, and set it on the desk in front of her without comment. She looked at him. He looked at the letter. She opened it. Caleb Montgomery had been formally charged, not just with the overpricing that was the smaller charge, the one that would require him to make restitution. The larger charge was fraud, filed under the new territorial commercial statutes, which carried with it the possibility of genuine legal consequence. The folded paper in his own handwriting, found behind the ledger cover, had been the decisive piece. She read the letter through twice. Then she set it down. It's done, she said. Ethan had been watching her face. How do you feel? She thought about that. Like it's over, she said. Not triumphant. She looked at him. I don't need him punished particularly. I just needed the record to be correct. The record is correct, Ethan said. Yes. She folded the letter. Your water rights are secure. The overcharging restitution will cover the 2 new ranch hands and the fence and probably the seed you need for the south field. She paused. The ranch is in better shape than it's been in 3 years. Because of you, he said. Because the truth was always there, she said. I just organized it. He shook his head slightly. Not disagreeing, more the gesture of a man who has learned to recognize when Clara was being accurate at the expense of being fair to herself, and who had decided that pointing it out was part of his job. Because of you, he said again. She let him have that. It was Joe who told her what Ethan had done in town. She found out on a Thursday afternoon when Joe came to the barn where she was working through the seed inventory and sat down on his upturned crate and said, with the air of a man delivering information he considers important, "You know, Ethan went to see Margaret Hale." Clara looked up from the inventory. "When?" Monday, Joe said. "The day after the verdict." "Before you were up." She put down her pencil. "What for?" Joe picked up a piece of straw and turned it in his fingers. "He went to her house," Joe said. "Knocked on the door at 7 in the morning." Which is Ethan doesn't make social calls, so you can imagine what Margaret Hale's face looked like when she opened that door. He paused for effect in the way he did with his mule stories. He told her, and I have this from Hattie Drummond, who has it from Helen Pruitt, who apparently was walking past and heard the whole thing through the fence. He told Margaret Hale that she owed Clara a public apology and that if she had something to say about the people on his ranch in the future, she ought to make sure she had the facts first. Clara stared at him. "He said that," she said. "He said that," Joe confirmed. And then, this is the part I like, Margaret Hale said something about it not being his place to tell her what to do. And Ethan said that a person's place is wherever they decide to stand. And then he tipped his hat and walked away. The barn was very quiet. "He didn't tell me," Clara said. No, Joe agreed. "He wouldn't. That's not how he does things. He's not the kind of man who does something and then tells you about it so you'll think well of him." Joe turned the piece of straw. "He does things because they need doing. That's all." Clara sat with this. She thought about 8 years of a man choosing solitude, of a door that had been stuck, of a woman on a fence in the dark, keeping still because stillness was what was needed. "Joe," she said. Did he ever in those 8 years? Was there ever anyone who—" "No," Joe said simply. "Not even close." He looked at her with the clear, uncomplicated honesty of a man who had run out of time for anything other than directness. "There was nobody, and then there was you." 2 weeks after the verdict, something changed in Harlow Creek. It was gradual. The way things in small towns always are, not a single moment of reversal, but an accumulation of small adjustments. Hattie Drummond had begun referring people who needed accounting help to the ranch, on the grounds that she knew someone with the necessary skill. Helen Pruitt had stopped by twice with preserves, and the kind of conversation that was about more than preserves. The women at the church, not all of them, and not Margaret Hale, who was reportedly working up to something but hadn't managed it yet, had started acknowledging Clara in the direct, respectful way of people who have revised a prior assessment and intend to live with the revision without making a production of it. Thomas, the 17-year-old ranch hand who delivered bad news with a guilty expression, started asking Clara questions about numbers, not because anyone told him to, but because he'd been watching her work for 2 months and had figured out that numbers were a skill, like any other skill, and this was a person who could teach it. She taught him. She started with the basics. She cleared a corner of the kitchen table after supper and sat him down with a ledger and a pencil and explained, in the plain, patient way she'd developed over years of doing this for herself, how accounts worked, how you tracked what came in against what went out, how you looked for patterns, how the numbers told you what was happening in the business before anything else did. Thomas was not a natural. He made errors. He erased things until the paper wore thin. But he came back the next evening, and the one after that, and Clara found that teaching was something she was good at, not just the mathematics but the patience. The willingness to explain the same thing 6 different ways until one of them landed. Ethan watched from the doorway one evening, arms crossed, saying nothing. When Thomas had gone to bed, he came and sat at the kitchen table across from her and said, "You've got a gift for that." "Teaching," she said. "Seeing how someone learns," he said, adjusting. Finding the way in, he paused. "It's the same thing you do with the accounts, with people." She looked at him. Are you comparing Thomas to a ledger? I'm saying you pay the same kind of attention to both, he said. The kind that finds what's actually there instead of what you expected. She thought about that. Helen Pruitt asked me last week, she said slowly, if I'd be willing to help her understand her husband's accounts. He died 2 years ago and she's been managing the ranch herself, and she doesn't entirely understand what she's looking at. Ethan nodded. And Hattie, Clara said. She's been sending people to me. 3 families in the last 2 weeks. I know, he said. Hattie doesn't do things by accident. Clara looked at the ledger on the table. Then at Ethan. There are women in this valley, she said, who are managing land and households and businesses that their husbands left them. And they weren't taught. Nobody thought they needed to know. She felt the shape of something forming. The way an idea does when it's been below the surface for a while and finally finds its way up. What if Ethan said? She looked at him. I haven't said it yet. I know, he said. But I can see it on your face. He held her eyes steadily. Whatever it is, yes. She felt the warmth of that, the simple, extraordinary thing of being known well enough to be said yes to before you'd found the words. I want to teach, she said formally. Not just Thomas. Not just individual families who happen to ask. I want to hold sessions. Here or in town. Regular. For women who need to understand their accounts. Who need to be able to read their own contracts. She looked at her hands. Because if I had understood contracts the way I do now when I arrived in Montana, I would have spotted what Montgomery was doing in the first 5 minutes. And there are women all over this territory who are sitting with contracts they don't understand. Trusting people they shouldn't, because nobody ever thought their financial understanding was worth investing in. The kitchen was quiet. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Use the main room, he said. There's more space, she blinked. Just like that, he said. This is your home, Clara. Use it the way you want to. The words landed in her chest like something she'd needed to hear for 27 years. Your home. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the table. Thank you, she said very quietly. Don't thank me, he said. I'm being selfish. I want to watch you do this. She looked up at him. You want to watch me teach bookkeeping to ranchers' wives, she said. I want to watch you do anything you decide to do, he said. Simply, without decoration. It's the best thing I've found to do with an evening. The first session happened 3 weeks later. 7 women came. Helen Pruitt, who arrived early and arranged the chairs. 2 women Clara didn't know well yet, from ranches north of town, who came together and sat close to each other, in the way of people who feel slightly out of their depth, but have decided that feeling out of your depth is worth it. A young widow named Susan Park, who was 26 and terrified and determined. A woman of 60 named Agnes, who had been running her late husband's cattle operation for 4 years entirely on instinct and wanted, she said, to know if her instincts had been right. And in the back row, Margaret Hale. Clara saw her when she walked in and felt the particular, familiar experience of her stomach dropping and her face staying still. She had not invited Margaret Hale. She had not excluded her either. She had told Hattie to spread the word. And Hattie had done exactly that. Margaret Hale sat in the back row, with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the front of the room and said nothing. Clara set her ledger on the table. She looked at the 7 women in front of her. She thought about a 12-year-old girl sitting at her father's desk, teaching herself how numbers worked, because nobody was going to teach her and somebody had to do the accounts. She thought about all the years she'd spent making herself invisible. She thought about what Martha had said in the office. All those weeks ago, you seem like you're hiding from something. She wasn't hiding anymore. Good morning, she said. My name is Clara Whitlock. I'm going to teach you how to read your own accounts, how to understand the contracts you sign, and how to know when someone is misrepresenting numbers to you. She paused. Most of what I'm going to tell you is not complicated. It was never complicated. It was just never explained to you. Because people assumed you didn't need to know. She looked around the room. You needed to did. We're just starting late. Agnes, in the fourth row, let out a short, emphatic sound that was halfway between a laugh and an amen. Susan Park was already writing things down, and Margaret Hale, in the back row, was looking at Clara with an expression that Clara didn't try to read or manage or account for. Whatever was happening in that woman's mind was her own business. Clara had stopped needing to manage other people's conclusions about her. She opened the ledger and began. The twist nobody saw coming arrived on a Thursday. 4 weeks after the first teaching session. A letter. Not from her father this time. She'd written to Horace Whitlock 3 weeks ago. A letter that was polite and clear and entirely final. Telling him that she was staying in Montana, that she was well, that she would write occasionally, and that she wished him no ill but intended to live her life on her own terms. She had not asked for his approval. She had not apologized. He had not written back, which she found, on reflection, a relief. This letter was from the Territorial Commissioner's office. Addressed to her, not to Ethan, not to Hartwell, to her. By name. She opened it at the kitchen table with Martha watching from the stove and Joe pretending to read something in the corner. It was from Commissioner Beaumont. He was writing, the letter said, to inform her that the Territorial Commissioner's office had received a formal commendation from the Territorial Prosecutor, referencing the documentation she had prepared in the matter of Colhart versus Montgomery. He wanted her to know that the quality of that documentation, its organization, its completeness, its evidentiary value had been exceptional. He further wanted to inform her that the Territorial Office was establishing a new position, a records and accounts examiner, to assist with commercial fraud investigations across the territory. The position had not previously existed. It had been created, the letter said, because the Colhart case had demonstrated clearly that the territory needed someone who could do what she had done. He was asking if she was interested. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table. She sat for a moment looking at the window. Well, Martha said from the stove. There's a letter, Clara said. I can see there's a letter, Martha said. What does it say? Clara told her. The sound Martha made was not words exactly. It was the sound of a woman who has been waiting for justice to arrive at a correct conclusion and is deeply satisfied to see it do so. Joe put down whatever he'd been pretending to read. What are you going to do? He asked. I don't know yet, Clara said honestly. I need to think about it. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She went to find Ethan. He was at the fence with the bay mare, the one that had been wild and skittish when Clara arrived and was now, after months of patient work, a different animal. Steady. Trusting. Still herself, but no longer afraid of being herself. Clara leaned on the fence beside him. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. She watched his face while he did the careful, contained way he processed things, the slight tightening at the jaw that meant something had landed. He folded the letter and handed it back. How do you feel? He asked. I don't know, she said, surprised. Which I shouldn't be. I know what I did. I know the quality of it. She looked at the mare. But someone else knowing it, someone saying it officially. In a letter with a seal on it. She stopped. It's different. It shouldn't have to be different, he said. No, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then are you going to take it? She looked at him. The position would require travel, she said, across the territory. Case by case when the commissioner's office has a matter that needs. Clara, he said. She stopped. Are you asking me if I want you to take it? He said. She was quiet. Because if that's what you're asking, he said, then I want you to understand something. He turned to face her directly. Fully, the way he did when something mattered. I am not your father. I am not someone you make yourself smaller for. His voice was even and absolutely certain. "Whatever you want to do with your skill and your mind and your time, I want that for you. All of it. This ranch doesn't need you to stay small to be mine." She looked at him. "I don't know if I want to take it," she said honestly. "I built something here. I'm teaching. The ranch," she shook her head. "I don't know." "Then write to Beaumont," Ethan said. "Ask him what it looks like in practice. Ask what the travel requires. Get the information." He held her eyes, "and then decide. Based on what you want, not on what anyone else needs from you." She took a long breath. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It is simple," he said. "You've just spent a long time being told it isn't." She looked at the mountains. She thought about a woman who had pressed a letter to her chest in a kitchen in Tennessee and hadn't cried, who had packed a single bag on a Thursday night and left her father's accounts on the desk and gotten on a train heading west, who had told a man she didn't know that she intended to be here on her own terms. She had meant that then. She meant it even more now. "I'll write to him," she said. "Good," Ethan said. He turned back to the mare. He was quiet for a moment. "Then whatever you decide, I want you to know something." "What?" she said. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the horse, and his voice had the quality it got when he was saying something important, in the way of someone who had learned that the most important things should be said plainly. "The night you arrived," he said, "I was ready to send you away. Not because of anything you'd done, because I was afraid of what it would mean to have someone here who actually saw things. Who noticed." He paused. "I'd gotten very comfortable with nobody noticing." "I know," she said quietly. "You noticed everything," he said, "from the first day. The accounts, the mare, Joe's knee when the weather changes." He was still watching the horse. "You noticed me, in a way I'd forgotten was possible." He turned to look at her then. "I'm a better man for having been seen by you. I want you to know that. Whatever comes next, whatever you decide, you change this place. You changed me." He held her eyes. "That doesn't go away." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You saw me first." He shook his head slightly. "No, on the first day," she said. "Everyone else in my life looked at me and saw what I wasn't. What I lacked, what I couldn't offer." She held his gaze steadily. "You looked at me and just looked. Like you were actually interested in what was there." She paused. "I hadn't had that before, not once." The mare moved quietly in the paddock. "I wrote back to my father," she said. Ethan waited. "I told him I was staying," she said. "I told him I was well. I told him I was happy." She paused. "He hasn't written back." "I don't think he will." "Is that all right?" Ethan asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "Yes," she said. She looked at the mountains. "I spent a long time trying to be enough for people who had decided I wasn't before they knew me. I don't have room for that anymore." She looked back at him. "I have things I'm building. Just once." The nod of a man who understood. "Yes," he said. "You do." 1 year after Clara May Whitlock arrived in Montana with one bag and no promises, she stood on the porch of the Hearth ranch in the late afternoon of a summer day and looked at what the year had made. The ranch was the same land it had always been, same mountains, same creek, same timber on the upper slopes, but it breathed differently. 2 new hands, young men who worked hard and were treated fairly, were coming back from the north pasture. Thomas was in the office, working through the weekly accounts with the careful concentration of a person discovering they are better at something than they thought. Agnes, who had come to the first teaching session and hadn't stopped coming, was inside with Martha, the two of them working through a contract Agnes had received from a new supplier, identifying every clause worth questioning. Inside the house, in what had become, without a formal announcement, through the accumulation of coffee cups and morning conversations, and a hand-turned palm up on a wagon seat, their home. Grace's most recent letter was on the kitchen table. She was in Billings, She was good at the boarding house work. She had made a friend named Dorothy, who she described in 4 paragraphs. She had written to their father. He had written back 1 paragraph. Stiff and brief, but he had written back. She had not come back to Tennessee. Commissioner Beaumont's offer was still on Clara's desk. She had written to him, as Ethan said. She had asked the practical questions. The position required monthly travel to Billings, occasional travel to Helena. Availability when a case arose. It was not incompatible with a life rooted somewhere. It was not incompatible with a home. She had written to accept it 3 weeks ago. She was the first person to hold the position. There was no template for what it was supposed to look like. She was building it the same way. She built everything from the beginning. Methodically, paying attention to what was actually there rather than what she'd expected. She heard the door behind her. She didn't turn. Ethan came to stand beside her on the porch. He was still in his work clothes, the hat pushed back on his head. Smelling of horses and summer and the particular familiar warmth that she had stopped being surprised to find she looked forward to. He stood beside her, and they looked at the ranch together in the long golden light. "Long day," he said. "Good day," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then Agnes is staying for supper." "I know," she said. "Martha's already added her to the pot." Another quiet moment. "I got a letter today," he said, "from the bank in Billings. The restitution from Montgomery cleared. The full amount." She nodded. She'd been expecting it. "I want to put half into the operational fund," he said. "And the other half into the teaching sessions. Materials. Space in town if you decide you need it. Whatever you need." He paused. "It's your money as much as mine. You found it." She turned to look at him. He was watching the mountains with that contained, patient expression that had become as familiar to her as the sound of the creek. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "I have something to ask you," she said. He waited. She had thought about this for a long time. Not nervously, she wasn't a nervous person, fundamentally but carefully. The way she thought about important things, turning it over, looking at it from every angle, making sure of what she found. "I came here with 1 bag," she said. "I remember," he said. "I came here with no promises and no expectations," she said. "I told you I intended to be here on my own terms." She held his eyes. I have been from the beginning." She paused. "And I want to keep being. On my terms." She let the next words come the way she'd decided they should, plainly. "Without performance. With you. Properly, if you want that." The porch was quiet. Ethan Colehart looked at her for a long moment. 8 years of a closed door. 8 years of a shape of an empty place. 8 years of building a life so carefully self-sufficient that nobody could leave it diminished because there was nothing to take. And then a woman with 1 bag who had told him she intended to be here on her own terms. "Clara May Whitlock," he said, and his voice had something in it she had never heard there before. Something cracked open. Something that had been pressed flat for a very long time finally allowed its actual shape. "I have been wanting to ask you the exact same thing since the night you found the numbers in the ledger and came to tell me before you were even certain." He reached out and took her hand the way he always did. Simply. "With absolute intention. Yes, with everything I have." "Yes." She looked at him. This honest, patient, fundamentally good man who had learned to see her before she'd learned to be seen. She laced her fingers through his. "Good," she said. The summer wind moved through the fields. The mountains held their position against the sky. Permanent and indifferent to the particular small drama of 2 people standing on a porch deciding to be brave. The horses moved in the paddock. Inside, Martha was telling Agnes something emphatic about contract clauses that was making Agnes laugh. Clara stood in the long golden light of a Montana summer evening and felt the full, unambiguous weight of a life that was entirely irreversibly hers. She had not been chosen out of desperation or convenience, or the cold arithmetic of a father who needed 1 less daughter to account for. She had chosen. She had walked toward this place on her own feet, with her own bag, on her own terms, and she had built something real inside it, not just the accounts, not just the teaching sessions, not just the documentation that had brought a fraudulent man to justice. She had built herself, the version of herself that had always existed but never had the room. She had found the room, she had made it, and standing there with her hand in Ethan's hand, and the mountains at her back, and everything she had earned around her, Clara May Whitlock was not someone who had been sent away. She was not someone who had been given away. She was not the plain sister, the overlooked daughter, the woman nobody chose. She was the woman who had chosen, and that made all the difference in the world.